The auctioneer grabbed her by the rope around her wrists and yanked her forward like she was a sack of grain he was tired of carrying. "Comes free with the horses," he announced, grinning at the crowd. "No name, no papers, no problem." The men laughed. She didn't move, didn't cry, just stood there barefoot in the dirt, her torn dress stiff with dust, her eyes fixed on the ground like she'd already decided the ground was safer than faces. That was the moment Silas Cain saw her, and that was the moment he understood that something in this territory had gone deeply, permanently wrong. If this story already has you feeling something, you're in the right place. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The auction at Callow Flats ran every third Saturday of the month, and it drew exactly the kind of crowd you'd expect from a dying stretch of frontier territory. Men who were either desperate enough to buy anything or wealthy enough to buy everything, with very little in between. Silas Cain arrived in the second category by habit, and the first category by reality. He came for horses. He had $23 left to his name, the deed to 400 acres of land that hadn't produced a profitable season in 3 years, and a cattle operation that was more memory than business at this point. What he needed were 2 working horses, strong enough to pull, old enough to be cheap, and healthy enough not to die on him before spring. What he did not need was anything that complicated his life further. He'd been clear about that with himself on the 2-hour ride out from the ranch. Keep your head down. Buy the horses. Come home. Figure out how to make it another season without borrowing money from men who would use that debt to own you. He hadn't figured on the auction going the way it did. The first half of the morning was straightforward enough. Cattle went through in small lots, a few pieces of farm equipment nobody really wanted. Changed hands at prices that embarrassed the sellers, and the crowd drank bad coffee and complained about the weather the way men in this part of the country always did, like the sky owed them something and kept failing to pay. Silas stood near the back fence with his hat pulled low, watching 2 horses get led around the ring by a bored handler. They were a mismatched pair, a gray mare with one cloudy eye and a brown gelding who moved like his left foreleg had an old injury that hadn't healed quite right. Other men looked at them and looked away. Silas looked at them and saw something that wasn't nothing. The gray was sound in 3 legs, and her clouded eye was old damage, not spreading sickness. The gelding's limp was in the hip, not the leg, a muscle issue, maybe something that rest and decent feed could improve. They were thin, they were tired, they'd been worked past where they should have been pushed, but they weren't broken. $20 for both, Silas said when the bidding stalled at 16. A man 2 rows up turned to look at him. Reed Holt, youngest son of Garrett Holt, who owned the biggest spread in 3 counties and never let anyone forget it. Reed was 24 years old and had the kind of face that came from never having been told no about anything that mattered. 22, Reed called out, not because he wanted the horses, but because he didn't like the idea of Silas Cain getting something without a fight. Silas looked at the horses, looked at his $23. 23. The crowd went quiet in that particular way crowds do when something small is about to become something else. Reed smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. 25. And that was that. Silas didn't have 25. He stood there with his hands in his coat pockets and his jaw set, and he accepted the fact that he'd just lost 2 horses to a rich man's son who didn't need them. Except the auctioneer held up his hand before Silas could turn away. "Wait a moment," the man said. He had a voice like gravel in a tin can, and he was looking at something beyond the ring fence that Silas couldn't see yet. "These 2 animals come with something extra. Seller didn't mention it this morning, but I've been informed." He paused for effect. "A bonus, you might say." The handler led the horses aside, and 2 of Vale's hired hands came through the gate from the far end of the yard, and between them was a woman. She walked because they were pulling her forward by the rope looped around her wrists, not because she chose to. She was barefoot. Her dress had been torn at the shoulder and mended badly, the thread a different color than the cloth. Her hair was loose and tangled. She kept her eyes on the ground. The crowd reacted the way crowds do when something shocks them and entertains them at the same time. With noise, with laughter, with the particular ugliness that comes from men who feel comfortable because they're surrounded by other men doing the same thing. "What in the—" someone said. Free bonus, the auctioneer repeated, grinning now, working the crowd. No name on paper, no family claiming her. Comes with the animals, gentlemen, part of the lot. Reed Holt laughed out loud. He stepped up to the ring fence and looked at the woman the way he'd looked at the horses, assessing, dismissive, then suddenly interested in a way that was worse than dismissal. I'll take her separate, he said. Whatever you want for her. She comes with the horses, the auctioneer said. Package deal. 25 takes all three. Done, Reed said immediately. He didn't even look at Silas. He was already looking at the woman, and the way he was looking made the back of Silas's neck go cold. The woman hadn't moved, hadn't looked up. But her hands, her bound hands, had gone very still, the kind of stillness that isn't calm. It's the stillness of someone who has learned that reacting makes things worse. Silas had seen that stillness before. He'd seen it in animals that had been hit enough times that they'd stopped flinching. It wasn't peace. It was something that used to be a person's spirit and had been pressed down into something smaller. He didn't plan what he did next. He would have told you that himself after, if you'd asked him. He wasn't a man given to impulse or grand gestures. He'd spent his whole adult life making careful, practical decisions and watching them fail anyway, which had taught him to be even more careful and even more practical. But he heard himself speak before he'd thought it through. 25, he said, for the horses. The auctioneer frowned. Deal's already struck, friend. The deal includes an unlawful transaction, Silas said. His voice came out steadier than he felt. A person isn't property. You sell her separate from those horses, and you've got a problem with federal law, not just local custom. The crowd went from laughing to quiet in about 2 seconds. Reed turned to look at him fully for the first time. You want to be careful about finishing that sentence, Cain. I'm not finished yet, Silas said. He stepped forward to the ring fence. Untie her. Nobody moved. I said untie her. The handler looked at the auctioneer. The auctioneer looked at Reed Holt. Reed looked at Silas with the particular expression of a man calculating whether a public scene would cost him more than it would cost his target. She's nobody, Reed said. She showed up at the property line 3 days ago with nothing. My father's men found her. She can't prove who she is or where she came from. As far as the law's concerned, she doesn't exist. She's standing right there, Silas said. She exists fine. Something in the crowd shifted. Not sympathy exactly. It wasn't that kind of crowd. But there were men there who'd grown up on the frontier, who'd seen what happened when power ran without any check at all, and some of them had the decency to feel uncomfortable even if they didn't have the courage to say so. Reed held Silas's gaze for a long moment. Then he made a small gesture with his hand. One of the hired men pulled a knife and cut the rope. The woman's hands fell to her sides. She didn't rub her wrists, didn't look up, just stood there in the dirt like she wasn't sure what free felt like, and didn't want to trust it yet. She walks out of here on her own, Silas said. He turned to the auctioneers. I'll take the 2 horses at 23. 25 was the bid. From a transaction that included an unlawful element, Silas said. 23. And you keep this quiet because the alternative is I ride to the territorial office on Monday morning and explain what happened here today in detail. He didn't have any particular confidence that the territorial office would do anything about it. He'd dealt with territorial offices before, but the auctioneer didn't know the depth of his skepticism, and Reed Holt's father had his own reasons for not wanting official attention on his operations. The auctioneer looked at Reed. Reed looked at Silas with an expression that had moved past calculation into something colder. 23, he said. Take your horses, Cain. We'll see each other again. Probably, Silas agreed. He paid. He collected the horses. He walked to where the woman was still standing, a few feet from where the hired hands had left her, and he stopped. You don't have to come with me, he said. You can walk whatever direction you want. I'm not offering anything except that. She looked up for the first time. Her eyes were darker than he expected. Not frightened, or not only frightened. There was something behind the fear, something watchful and calculating that didn't match the rest of the picture she presented. She didn't say anything. I'm going north, Silas said. About 2 hours' ride. There's a bunkhouse on my property that nobody's using. If you need somewhere to sleep for a night or two while you sort out where you're headed, that's available. She looked at the horses, then at him, then at the crowd dispersing around them, men drifting away now that the entertainment was finished. She started walking north. Silas followed with the horses. He didn't know her name. He didn't know her story. He had $23 less than he'd arrived with, 2 horses that other men had thrown away, and a woman walking ahead of him who hadn't spoken a single word. It occurred to him, somewhere on the road home, that this was possibly the strangest day of his adult life. It did not occur to him that she had just changed everything. The ride back to the Cain property took longer than usual because the gray mare needed to be led carefully over the rocky stretch past Miller Creek. Her cloudy eye made her uncertain about the ground on her blind side, and she needed a patient hand on the lead rope rather than pressure. The woman walked ahead of them the whole way without looking back, picking her way along the trail with the particular attention of someone who had learned to read terrain out of necessity rather than habit. Silas watched her without making it obvious he was watching. She wasn't young in the way he'd first thought. Or rather, she wasn't as young as her situation had made her seem. Up close, without the rope and the dirt and the crowd pressing in on all sides, she looked like a woman in her late 20s or early 30s. Her posture, once the hired hands weren't forcing it, was straight. Her steps were deliberate. She chose her footing on the rocky ground with a precision that spoke of someone who'd been paying careful attention to the world around her for a long time. She also hadn't asked him a single question. Most people, in her situation, would have asked something. Where are we going? What do you want? Why did you do that back there? Even a frightened person usually had questions. She just walked. He let it be. The ranch came into sight around late afternoon. A main house that was decent but showing its age, a barn that needed a new roof on the eastern end, 2 smaller outbuildings, and fencing that stretched in all directions, most of it sound but one long section near the south pasture that he'd been meaning to fix since October. She stopped at the property line and looked at it. There's water at the pump by the barn, he said, and the bunkhouse is that building there, second one past the barn. I'll get a lamp and some blankets. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Thank you. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, steadier too, like someone who had decided exactly what they wanted to say before they said it, and wasn't going to say anything else. You're welcome, he said, which was the honest answer. He settled the horses in the barn, checked their feet, measured out some feed, and found her when he came back out standing at the pump with her face and hands washed, looking at the south pasture fence. Section's down, she said. I know. About 40 feet of it. The posts are rotted at the base, not the line itself. You can reuse the wire if you dig new posts. He looked at her. I'm just saying, she said, if you were trying to figure out whether it was worth fixing or replacing. How do you know about fence posts? She looked at him. That same watchful look from the auction, measuring, careful. I know about a lot of things, she said. Then, like she'd decided that was more than she meant to give, I'll sleep in the bunkhouse. I'll leave in the morning. She didn't leave in the morning. He found that out the next day at sunrise, when he walked out to start on the horses and found the south pasture fence already half repaired, 3 new posts dug and set in the cold ground, the old wire untangled and restrung with a neatness that spoke of practice. She was working on the 4th post when he got there, swinging a post driver with the steady rhythm of someone who'd done it before. He stood at a distance and watched her work. She didn't stop, didn't acknowledge him. You didn't have to do that, he finally said. I know. I didn't ask you to. I know that too. She drove the post down another inch. You fixed the rope, I fixed the fence. We're even. He almost said something about how they weren't exactly equivalent exchanges. He didn't. Instead, he went and got the wire stretcher from the barn and helped her finish. They worked through the morning without talking much. Just the kind of conversation that work requires. Hand me that, watch the tension there, drive it down another inch. And the particular companionship that comes from 2 people doing a job together without wasting words on things that don't need to be said. By noon, the fence was done. They stood at the end of the repaired line and looked at it. You're good at that, he said. I've fixed a lot of fences, she said. Then, like she'd been carrying the decision for a while and had finally set it down, My name is Eliza. Silas, he said. She nodded, like she already knew. You didn't ask my name at the auction, she said, or on the road. You didn't ask anything about me. Didn't figure it was my business. Most men would have asked. Most men would have also left you standing in that auction yard, he said. I'm not sure most men is a useful comparison. That landed somewhere. He could see it in the small shift of her expression. Not a smile, not quite, but something that had wanted to be one. I can help you with the barn roof, she said. East end. You'll lose the whole thing by winter if you don't get the damaged section replaced. He looked at her. You looked at my barn roof? I look at everything, she said. There was an apology in it. Just fact. He thought about it for a moment. About the $23 that were gone, and the barn roof that needed fixing, and the cattle operation that was running on fumes, and the feeling that had been sitting on his chest for 3 years like something he couldn't put down. All right, he said. But I want to know one thing. She waited. The auction, he said. How'd you end up there? Because what that man said about you showing up at the property line 3 days earlier, that wasn't the whole story. The watchful look came back, sharper this time. No, she said. It wasn't. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought she'd decided not to answer. Then she said, I was trying to get away from something. I made it further than I expected and not far enough. Away from what? She looked at him, and something in her face changed, not dramatically, not the way it happens in stories where people reveal everything at once in a rush of emotion, just a small, careful opening. The people whose property I supposedly appeared at the edge of, she said. The Holt family's land borders land I know. She paused, chose her next words carefully. The man at the auction, Reed Holt, his father, Garrett. They're connected to someone I've been running from. Who? She shook her head. Not yet. I'm not. I need to know I can trust what I'm saying to. He could respect that. He'd spent enough years learning who to trust in this territory, and the answer was usually fewer people than you thought, and only after you'd watched them for a while. Fair enough, he said. Roof needs to come first anyway. They started on the barn roof the next morning. She was better at it than he was, which he might have found uncomfortable except that she worked without showing off, without making a point of it, just doing the job the most efficient way she knew how and explaining when he asked and staying quiet when he didn't. She knew how to read damaged wood, which beams had rot you could work around and which ones needed to come out entirely. She knew how to calculate the pitch on a replacement section so the water would shed right. She knew which nails to pull and which to leave. Where'd you learn this? He asked on the second day, sitting on the ridge beam eating a cold lunch. By watching, she said, and by fixing things when they broke. Whose things? She chewed her bread and looked out at the flat expanse of his land. The horizon was enormous from up here. Big house, she said. Lots of things to fix. He let it go. On the third evening, she cooked supper without being asked, using what was in his pantry with the particular resourcefulness of someone accustomed to making something from not quite enough. It was better than anything he'd made for himself in months. He ate it without commenting on that because he suspected she already knew. You said the Holts are connected to someone you were running from, he said, when the meal was done and the lamp was low. The way you fixed this place the last 3 days. You're not running anymore. You're thinking. She looked at him across the table. I was thinking, she said, from the moment you said untie her. About what? About whether you were a man I could be honest with, she said. About what it would cost me. About what it would cost you. A pause. It'll cost you something. I want you to know that before I say anything else. Whatever I tell you, it's going to complicate your life. Silas looked at his empty plate, thought about his $23, his struggling cattle operation, his fence that had been down since October, and his barn roof that had been leaking since August, his land that had been his father's and his grandfather's, and that felt, more and more, like it was slipping out of his hands no matter what he did. My life's already complicated, he said. Tell me. She put her hands flat on the table, looked at them for a moment, then looked at him. My name is Eliza Voss, she said. My father is Gideon Vale. He didn't say anything. You know that name, she said. It wasn't a question. He knew it. Everybody in 3 territories knew it. Gideon Vale had built the largest land and mining operation in the region over 30 years, starting from nothing, or so the story went, and building himself into the kind of power that didn't need to threaten people openly because it had already arranged things so that threatening wasn't necessary. "Vale is your father," Silas said. "Yes." "And you were running from him." "Yes." He sat with that for a moment, then, "He let Reed Holt's men. He let them. He didn't let them do anything," she said. "He didn't know where I was. He was looking for me, but he didn't know. Holt's men found me by accident, but they knew who I was, or they knew enough to know I was worth something to the right people." She paused. "They were deciding whether to contact my father or to use me themselves. The auction was a way of making that decision without committing to either option, while also humiliating you. That was the bonus," she said flatly. Silas rubbed his face. "Why were you running? From your own father?" The lamp flickered. Outside, the wind pushed against the house with that dry autumn pressure that meant the temperature was dropping. "Because of what I know," she said. "Because of what I've seen. And because 6 months ago, I finally understood what he was planning to do with the information I carry, and I realized that if I stayed, eventually I'd be used as a tool to help him finish what he started." "What did he start?" She looked at him steadily. "You said your father lost this ranch once, that he nearly lost everything, that he borrowed from the wrong people, and the bank called the debt early, and somehow the paperwork got confused about who owned what, and by the time the court sorted it out, your family had lost 300 acres off the south end and the water rights to Miller Creek." Silas went very still. "That wasn't confusion," Eliza said. "The documents were altered, the bank officer was paid, the court clerk was convinced by a man my father trusted that the correct papers had been filed when they hadn't. Your family lost that land and those water rights because my father wanted the access to Miller Creek for his eastern expansion. Your father didn't fail. He was taken from." The room was very quiet. "I've seen the correspondence," she said. "I know the names, I know the amounts paid, I know the dates." She pressed her hands flat on the table like she was steadying herself. "I've been carrying that information for 4 years, and I didn't know what to do with it because doing something with it meant going against my father, and I thought—" She stopped. "I thought family meant something different than it does." Silas stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark, at the land that had been in his family and the land that hadn't been anymore, and the fence line where the old boundary used to run. "How many others?" he asked. "At least 11 families that I know of," she said. "Possibly more. Different methods each time, but the same structure underneath. Find a weakness, debt, family trouble, a bad season, and push on it until the legal situation gets complicated enough that a well-paid lawyer can make the paperwork say whatever's needed. 11 families." He turned from the window. "What were you planning to do?" he asked. "Before Holt's men found you." "I was going to the territorial capital," she said. "I have names, dates, and enough detail to give a federal investigator a place to start, but I can't get there alone. I don't have money. I don't have—" She stopped, and something shifted in her face, and for the first time she looked like what she was, which was someone who had been carrying something enormous for a very long time and was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. "I don't have anyone who knows me well enough to believe me and doesn't already owe my father something." Silas sat back down at the table. He looked at the woman across from him, the woman who had been sold at an auction 3 days ago and who had spent those 3 days fixing his fence and his barn roof and cooking his meals while she decided whether he was someone worth telling the truth to. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you told them to untie me," she said, "when you had no reason to, when it cost you something." She met his eyes. "Men who do things like that at cost to themselves. They're the only kind of men worth talking to." Outside, the wind pushed harder against the house. The lamp flame bent sideways for a moment, then steadied. Silas thought about his father, about the years his father had spent blaming himself for what had been done to him, about the way that blame had hollowed the man out from the inside until there wasn't much left but the ranch and the memory of what the ranch had once been, about his own years trying to hold what remained, fighting the land and the weather and the debt, and the feeling that he was losing a battle his family had already lost once before. The territorial capital is 3 days' ride, he said. I know. Vale has men throughout the region. If he's looking for you, he's looking for me. Then we'd need to move carefully, not the main road. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, we? Silas looked at his empty plate. His hands, the worn wood of the table that had been in this kitchen for as long as he could remember. You said 11 families, he said. I only know one of them personally, but 11's 11. He pushed his chair back. Get some sleep. We'll talk more in the morning about what we need to take and which route makes sense. He stood up. Silas, he looked back. You don't know what you're walking into, she said. My father is, I know what I'm walking into fine enough, he said. I've been walking into trouble my whole life. I'm used to it. He went to bed. He didn't sleep for a long time. Not because he was afraid exactly. More because he was thinking about a man he'd never met who had reached across years and distance and legal language to take something that belonged to his family, and was still out there, still doing it, still protected by money and influence and the particular comfort of power that had never been seriously challenged. And because he was thinking about the woman in his bunkhouse who had walked barefoot out of an auction yard and spent 3 days earning his trust and had just handed him the most dangerous information he'd ever held. 2 horses nobody wanted, and the woman nobody saw. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind against the house and thought about his father. Tomorrow, they'd start planning. He didn't sleep much. That was the truth of it. He lay on his back in the dark with his hands behind his head and stared at the ceiling and thought about his father. Not the man his father had been at the end. Quieter than silence, smaller than the chair he sat in. A man who had run out of explanations for why things had gone the way they went. He thought about the man before that, the one who had walked these same acres with a particular kind of pride that wasn't arrogance, just the solid knowledge that what he'd built was his and what was his was good. That man had died long before his body caught up. Silas had watched it happen slowly, the way you watch a fence post rot. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual disappearance of what held things upright. He'd spent years being angry at his father for giving up. Now he lay in the dark and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a clean name for. Not quite anger. Older than anger. The specific grief of a man who has just learned that the story he told himself about his own life was wrong, and that the true version is worse in every direction. He got up before dawn. The bunkhouse light was already on. He stood in the yard for a moment looking at the thin line of lamp glow under the bunkhouse door, and then he went to start the horses. When Eliza came out 20 minutes later, she was carrying a folded piece of paper. She'd been drawing, he realized, when she spread it on the fence post between them. A rough map, done from memory. The kind of thing that took knowledge of territory that most people didn't have. I was up anyway, she said, before he could ask. How long you been up? Since about an hour after I lay down. She smoothed the paper with the flat of her hand. I don't sleep well in new places. How long since you've slept in an old place? She looked at him sideways. A while. He studied the map. She'd marked the main roads and then crossed them out, drawing a secondary route that went northeast through the Callow Hills and then dropped down toward the river valley before cutting west to the capital. Longer by at least a day. More broken terrain, but away from the 3 main checkpoints where, she explained, her father maintained informal arrangements with the men who watched who came and went. These 2 points here, she said, touching marks on the paper. My father doesn't own the men at these posts, but he pays for information. Anyone who passes through matching our description gets reported. How do you know all this? Because for 4 years I sat at his dinner table and listened, she said. And before that, for 10 years before that, I watched how he built what he built. My mother thought I was a quiet child. I wasn't quiet, I was paying attention. Silas looked at the route she'd drawn. The cut through the Callow Hills was rough in autumn, rocky trail, uncertain water, no settlements for a 40-mile stretch. But he'd come through it once, 8 years back, during a bad winter when the main road washed out. He knew it was passable with the right horses. The gray mare's eye is going to be a problem on that terrain at night, he said. Then we move during daylight and camp before dark. That adds another half day. I know. We'll need 4 days minimum. I know that too. He folded the map and put it in his coat. I'll pack today. We leave tomorrow morning. She nodded. Then, instead of turning back to the bunkhouse, she stayed where she was, leaning against the fence post with her arms crossed, looking out at the land. What happens to this place while you're gone? She asked. He hadn't let himself think about that yet. Nothing good, he said honestly. You don't have anyone who can look after it? I had a hand through the summer. Dick's, good worker. He left in September when the pay ran out. He didn't say it with bitterness, just fact. There's nobody else. She was quiet. Then, I'm sorry. Don't be. It's not your fault the ranch is struggling. No, she said. But it's my father's. He didn't have an answer for that. He went to start the morning feeding. They spent the day preparing in the particular silence of people who are focused on something with consequences. Silas went through his supplies with the deliberate care of a man who knows that running short on the wrong thing at the wrong time is the difference between a bad situation and a fatal one. He pulled the jerky he'd put up in September, 2 good blankets, his medical kit, his rifle, and the ammunition he'd been rationing since spring. He found a second knife in the bottom of the tool chest, an old one with a good blade that just needed sharpening, and he sharpened it. Eliza spent the morning checking and rechecking the horses. The gelding's hip movement had improved noticeably after 3 days of decent feed and rest, and she worked through his flexibility with a careful, methodical attention that told Silas she'd done this before. Not as something learned from a book, but as daily practice, the accumulated knowledge of someone who'd spent years around animals that mattered. He'll make the hills, she said that afternoon. Slow on the loose rock, but sound. And the mare? The mare is tougher than she looks. Eliza ran a hand along the animal's neck. She's compensated for that eye for years. She reads the ground through her feet better than most horses do with both eyes. In the afternoon, she disappeared into the bunkhouse and came out an hour later with something he hadn't expected. A set of carefully written notes on 4 folded sheets of paper. She handed them to him without explanation. He unfolded the first one. Names, dates, amounts, locations. Written in a small, precise hand, organized by incident, each entry cross-referenced with the names of the men involved at each level of the operation. It was thorough in the way that only someone with a specific memory and years of careful observation could produce. Not legal documents, those were elsewhere, in places she'd tell him about if they made it to the Capitol, but detailed enough that an investigator with access to the right records would know exactly where to start looking. He looked up at her. If something happens to me, she said, you have enough there to at least point someone in the right direction. Nothing's going to happen to you. I'm not being dramatic, she said. I'm being practical. You should have a copy of what I know in case we get separated. He folded the papers carefully and put them inside his boot. She watched him do it. That's a good place for it, she said. I've carried things in worse. That night she cooked again. Something with dried beans and the last of a smoked ham he'd been working through, and she found a jar of pickled peppers on the back shelf of the pantry that he'd genuinely forgotten he had. It was a better meal than the situation probably deserved. They ate at the same table where she'd told him her name and her father's name, and the thing about his own family that had rewired the last 15 years of his understanding. Tell me about your father, he said. Not to pry, because if they were going to walk into the Capitol and stand in front of a federal judge with her testimony and his need for justice, he needed to understand what they were walking against. She set down her fork, thought for a moment. He's not a monster, she said. That's the complicated part. He's a man who decided early in his life that the rules existed to protect people who already had things, and since he didn't have things, the rules didn't apply to him. And then he got things, and somehow the reasoning never changed. She picked her fork back up and pushed a bean around the plate. He's charming. He's genuinely funny sometimes. He remembers the name of every person he's ever met and asks about their children and their animals and their land because he cares. But the caring is a tool, not a feeling. Did he care about you? The question sat there between them for a moment. In his way, she said finally, he wanted me to be something he could be proud of, something he could use. He'd have said those two things were the same. She put her fork down again. I thought for a long time that if I was useful enough, the other things wouldn't matter, the way he treated people, the things he took. I told myself that all men with power made compromises. What changed? I read the file on your family, she said simply. Not because I was looking for it. I was organizing papers in his study. I did that sometimes. He trusted me with the business records. And I found a folder with your father's name on it, and I read it. She was quiet for a moment. There was a letter in there from your father to a bank officer, begging, explaining that the paperwork couldn't be right because he'd filed correctly. He had the copies. Something had gone wrong. She paused, and there was a note in my father's handwriting at the bottom. It said, "Resolved." Silas's jaw tightened. I stood in that study for a long time, she said. And then I put the file back where it was, and I walked out, and I spent the next 6 months figuring out how to do this. She looked at him. There were 11 other files. He thought about his father's letter, the desperate, careful language of a man trying to explain that something unjust had happened, addressed to a man who already knew and had already been paid. He thought about that letter sitting in a file in Gideon Vale's study with a note at the bottom that said, "Resolved." 11 other files, he said, and possibly more that were kept elsewhere. Those were only the ones from his personal study. He stood up and took the plates to the wash basin. He stood there for a moment with his hands in the water. "We leave at first light," he said. Yes, they left at first light. The first day went better than expected. The Callow Trail was hard but familiar enough in its upper stretches that Silas could set a decent pace, and the horses, given 3 days of rest and feed, moved with more energy than they'd shown at the auction. The gray mare picked her way across the rocky sections with the careful competence Eliza had promised. The gelding kept up without favoring his hip. Eliza rode in front on the mare, reading the trail with the same attention she gave everything. She'd found a pair of boots in the bunkhouse, an old pair Silas hadn't worn in years that were 2 sizes too large but better than bare feet on mountain rock. And she'd stuffed the toes with wool from a torn blanket. She hadn't mentioned this. He'd noticed it and hadn't mentioned it either. They stopped at noon to water the horses at a stream crossing where the trail widened enough to breathe. "How far behind do you think they are?" he asked. He didn't have to explain who he meant. She looked back down the trail the way a person does when they're trying to calculate invisible distances. "My father won't have known I was at the Holt auction. He'll have known I was in the region. He always has people watching for me, but they report slowly because they're afraid of being wrong." She was quiet for a moment. "Reed Holt is the problem. He knows I exist and he knows I left with you. He'll have sent word to someone by now." "To your father?" "Possibly directly. More likely to someone who reports to my father because Reed would want credit for the information without the risk of being wrong about who I am." She turned back to the trail. "Reed's careful that way. He takes risks, but he wants the downside insulated." "You know him well." "I've met men like him my whole life," she said. "They're my father's preferred business associates. Smart enough to be useful, ambitious enough to want to please, not principled enough to say no to anything profitable." She started the mare moving again. "They're not the dangerous ones. The dangerous one is my father's man, Cord Bauer. He's the one my father sends when he needs something done without error." "What does Bauer look like?" "Tall, heavy through the shoulders. He's missing the tip of his left index finger." She said it the way you describe someone you've been afraid of for years, with a flat specificity that keeps the fear from showing. "He doesn't talk more than necessary. He's patient." "You've seen him work?" A pause. "Once, when I was 17, a man came to my father's office claiming he had copies of certain documents and would take them to the territorial authorities unless compensated. My father sent for Bauer." She stopped talking. "Did the man have copies?" Silas asked. "I don't know," she said. "I never saw him again." They rode without speaking for a while after that. The trail climbed through a section of broken limestone that required full attention from all 4 of them, horses and riders alike. And by the time they'd crested it and found easier ground on the other side, the sun had moved significantly west and the temperature was dropping. They made camp in a hollow between 2 rock faces that blocked the wind from the north. Silas built a small fire, small enough to be defensible, not large enough to be seen from any significant distance. And they ate cold food rather than cook anything that would produce smell and smoke in quantity. "You're good at this," Eliza said. She was sitting with her back against the rock, her knees drawn up, her boots still on. She hadn't taken them off since morning. Good at what? Moving carefully, setting a camp. You've done this before. I don't mean casually, I mean seriously. He fed a small piece of wood into the fire. I spent 2 years working cattle drives when I was younger, before I came back to help my father with the ranch. Long drives north, sometimes into territories where the situation was uncertain. He paused. You learn to move through uncertain situations without advertising yourself. Were you good at it? The drives. Good enough to come home, he said. She looked at him for a moment. That's a funny way to measure success. It's the most accurate one I've found. She almost smiled. He was getting better at reading the almost smiles. Tell me about the 11 families, he said. Not because he needed to know right then. Because she'd been carrying it alone for a long time, and sometimes things got lighter when you said them out loud. She was quiet for a moment. Then she started talking. She went through them methodically. Not the way you'd recite a list, but the way you'd describe people you'd thought about at length in private. The Reimer family, who'd lost water rights to the North Creek after a bad debt got quietly purchased by one of Vale's holding companies. The Patton widow, whose husband had died during a dispute over a boundary survey that turned out to have been falsified. A man named Greer, who'd built a mill on land he'd bought legally and found himself in a legal proceeding that made no sense until he ran out of money to fight it. Others with similar shapes to their stories, different details, same architecture underneath, the deliberate application of legal and financial pressure until the outcome was inevitable. Did any of them know about each other? Silas asked. No. That was part of the method. Each case looked separate. Each one looked like the victim's own failure or bad luck. And because they were scattered across different counties with different court systems, nobody ever put the pattern together. She paused. Except me. How did you know to look for the pattern? I grew up watching my father build it, she said. When you've seen enough of how something is constructed, you start to see it everywhere. Like how a carpenter can walk into any building and see immediately which walls are load-bearing and which aren't. He's not guessing. He's reading what he already knows. She pulled her coat tighter. I wasn't looking for a pattern. I just couldn't stop seeing it. Silas thought about that for a while. About a girl sitting at her father's dinner table, watching, listening, accumulating detail, not yet knowing what she'd do with it. When you read my family's file, he said, Did your father know you'd seen it? No. But you could have gone to him, said this doesn't seem right. Why is this man writing you letters about his documents? She looked at the fire. I could have, she said. I almost did. A pause. But I knew what he'd say. He'd have explained it. He's very good at explaining things in ways that make sense until you're out of the room and thinking clearly again. And I wasn't ready yet. I needed more time to decide what I actually believed. What made you decide? The note, she said. Resolved. That one word. It was so small and so complete. Whatever had happened to your family, whatever your father had tried to do to fight it, my father had summed it up in one word and moved on. She looked up at him. I thought if I stay, eventually I become the kind of person who can write notes like that. And I didn't want to be that person. The fire cracked. Somewhere out in the dark, a night bird called once and went quiet. Silas added the last piece of wood. Get some sleep, he said. I'll take the first watch. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he said. But Bauer's patient. You said that yourself. Patient men move at night. She looked at him. Then she pulled her coat around herself and lay down on her blanket and closed her eyes. He sat with the dying fire and the silence and the cold and thought about what came next. The second day started wrong. They'd been on the trail for less than an hour when Silas saw the dust. It was far behind them, maybe 4 miles, maybe 5, but the trail through the lower hills ran in long, visible curves, and on a clear morning you could see movement at considerable distance if you knew where to look. Silas knew where to look. Don't stop, he said to Eliza. Keep moving. Look at the trail, not behind you. She didn't turn. How many? 2 riders? Could be travelers. Could be, she said, not convincingly. We're going to turn off the main trail at the next fork. There's a shepherd's track that runs east of the limestone ridge. It's slower, but it closes off sight lines. You know this area well. Well enough. He kept his voice level. We're going to move at a canter for the next 10 minutes. The gelding will manage it. They moved. The shepherd's track was exactly where he remembered it. Barely a track at all, more like a suggestion in the grass where animals had walked often enough to leave an impression. It ran close against the rock face of the limestone ridge and then curved northeast in a long loop that would bring them back to the main line but 2 miles further on, with the ridge between them and anyone following the obvious route. It was hard going. The gray mare stumbled twice on loose rock, caught herself both times, kept moving. The gelding's breathing went heavy on the uphill sections, but he didn't stop. When they came around the far end of the ridge, and Silas could see back across the valley to the main trail, there was nothing visible. Either the riders hadn't followed or they'd passed the turnoff without seeing it. Do we stop? Eliza asked. We keep moving, he said. We stop when I know we're clear. They rode for another 3 hours without a break. When they finally stopped to water the horses at a narrow creek, Eliza got down and immediately went to check the gelding's hooves, moving through the inspection with efficient hands while the horses drank. He threw a small stone, she said, holding up the gelding's right forefoot. He's fine, but we need to check at every stop. I know. She put the hoof down and stood up and looked at him. The riders, she said. Your gut. Bauer, he said, or men sent by Bauer. Yes. She said it without drama, without panic, just acknowledgement of a fact that both of them had already calculated. We won't make the capital in 4 days now, not with the detour and the pace we'll need to keep. 5 days, he said. Maybe 6. We don't have 6 days of food. I know. She was quiet for a moment. There's a family, she said slowly, like she was deciding whether to say it. The Reimers. The ones I mentioned. The family who lost the North Creek water rights. They're about 8 miles west of the route we're on now. If they'd take us in for a night, would they? I don't know, she said honestly. I'm the daughter of the man who took their water. That's not nothing. No, he said. But it's also not nothing that you're the one who's trying to fix it. She looked at him. Something crossed her face, complicated and quick, gone before he could name it. You're more optimistic than I am, she said. I'm a rancher who's had 3 bad years, he said. Optimism is all I've got left. This time she actually smiled, small, guarded, like something that had forgotten it was allowed to happen, but real. They turned west toward the Reimer land. He watched her as they rode, the way she sat the mare, not elegant, not the practiced posture of someone trained to look good on a horse, but effective, balanced. The posture of someone who'd ridden out of necessity and gotten competent because competence mattered. She kept scanning the landscape without making it look like scanning, her attention moving in a steady pattern that covered both what was ahead and what was at the edges. She caught him watching. What? She said. Nothing, he said, just thinking. About what? He considered how to say it. About how you held yourself at the auction, he said, eyes on the ground, quiet. I thought you'd given up. She rode for a moment before answering. I've never given up, she said. I've learned to look like I have when it's safer. She paused. There are men who, when they see a woman looking back at them directly, feel it as a challenge. Those men are more dangerous when challenged. So you look down, not because you're beaten, because you're managing the situation. And your father? Is the man who taught me that lesson, she said. Among others. The Reimer property came into view in the late afternoon. A modest spread, a house, a small barn, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for the season, smoke from the chimney, a dog that announced them from 30 yards out. A woman came to the door. 50s, heavy-set, with the particular wary look of someone who had learned to evaluate strangers carefully. Silas let Eliza take it. She got down from the mare slowly, making herself visible and non-threatening, and walked toward the house with her hands at her sides. My name is Eliza Voss, she said. My father is Gideon Vale. The woman in the doorway went very still. I know what he took from you, Eliza said. I'm going to the territorial capital to testify against him. I have documentation of what was done to your family and to 10 others. I'm asking for one night's shelter. That's all. The woman looked at her for a long moment. Then her eyes moved to Silas, still on his horse, with the two animals behind him. He's with me, Eliza said. His family is one of the 11. Another silence. Then the woman stepped back from the doorway. Get your horses out of sight, she said. Bring them behind the barn. They were inside before dark. The woman's name was Clara Reimer. Her husband had died 2 years after the water rights dispute, a fact she stated without sentiment and with a particular flatness that said the sentiment had been used up a long time ago. She fed them both without being asked, set up a pallet in the back room, and sat across the table from Eliza with her arms folded and listened for 2 hours without interrupting. When Eliza finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. You have all of this written down, she said. In detail. And you're willing to say it in front of a federal judge. Yes. Clara looked at her hands, at the table, at the wall, then at Eliza. My husband wrote 4 letters to the territorial office, she said. 4 letters, in 3 years. Not one of them got a response. I know. Do you know why? Because the man at the territorial office who handled water disputes was on my father's payroll. Eliza said it steadily. He retired 18 months ago. The man who replaced him is clean. I've confirmed that. Clara looked at her for a long time. You sound like your father, she said. It wasn't a compliment. The way you know things, the way you've organized it. Eliza didn't flinch. I know, she said. How do I know you're not here for some other reason? Some reason that benefits him? You don't, Eliza said. Not for certain. You have to make a judgment. She met the woman's eyes. But he threw me away at an auction. He didn't know where I was or what I was doing. And this man, she gestured toward Silas, spent his last $23 to buy 2 horses nobody wanted, and when they threw me in with the lot, he made them cut the rope and didn't ask me for a thing in return. She paused. I've been around men who use people my whole life. He doesn't. Clara looked at Silas. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to add. Clara unfolded her arms. She pulled her chair in closer to the table. Tell me what you need, she said. They stayed up late. Clara knew the territory between here and the capital better than either of them. She'd spent years moving through it, quietly, since her husband died, maintaining quiet connections with other families in similar situations. She knew which routes were watched. She knew a name in the capital, a lawyer, a woman who had tried twice to build cases against Vale's operations and been shut down both times for lack of evidence. Margaret Hollis, Claire said. She's still practicing. She'll want to hear from you. Eliza wrote the name down. And there's a man about 15 miles north of here who lost his mill to a Vale operation 4 years back, Claire said. Greer. He's been sitting on his anger for 4 years. If you send word that something's actually moving, he'll come. Come to the capital? He's been waiting for a reason, Clara said simply. Silas sat and watched the 2 women build something out of the available materials. Connections, names, routes, the accumulated small knowledge of people who'd been paying attention to an injustice for years without any way to act on it. It wasn't dramatic. It was practical and careful and slow, but it was real. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing. Inside, the lamp burned steadily on the table where Clara Reimer's husband had written 4 letters that were never answered. Eliza caught Silas's eye across the table. Something in her expression had changed since the afternoon. Not lighter exactly, but less alone. The particular shift of someone who has been carrying a weight by herself and has just had someone else put a hand under the other side. He gave her a small nod. She turned back to Clara and kept talking. Tomorrow, the capital. They were not close yet, and the road ahead was uncertain, and Cord Bauer was patient. But in a kitchen 15 miles off the main trail, 2 women were drawing a map that might finally be enough. They left the Reimer place before the sun was fully up, Clara standing in the doorway with her arms crossed against the cold, watching them go without ceremony. She wasn't a woman who made a production of things. She'd fed them, sheltered them, and given them what she knew, and that was enough. When Eliza turned in the saddle to look back, Clara raised one hand briefly and then went inside. It It was the most useful goodbye Silas had seen in years. The route Clara had drawn for them on the back of an old envelope cut northeast through a section of low scrub country before rejoining the main trail about 12 miles above the last checkpoint. It was good information, the kind that only came from someone who'd been moving quietly through a territory for a long time, learning its geography the way you learn the layout of a house you've lived in so long you can navigate it in the dark. They rode without talking for the first hour. The cold was the kind that settled into your hands and didn't leave, and the sky above the hills was the particular flat gray of a morning that couldn't decide whether it intended to get worse. Silas watched the landscape and watched the trail behind them in the intervals when the terrain allowed it, and mostly thought about the name Clara had given them. Margit Hollis. Lawyer, capital city. 2 failed attempts to build a case against Vale's operations. "Tell me about Halls," he said, when the trail widened enough that they could ride abreast. Eliza had been thinking. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the way she was focused on something beyond the trail. She came back to the present. "I don't know her personally," she said, "but I know she existed because my father talked about her. Not often. He didn't give attention to things that didn't concern him, but he mentioned her twice that I remember, and both times there was something in the way he said her name." "What kind of something?" She considered. The way he talked about her was like a man discussing a persistent problem he'd managed to contain but hadn't fully solved. Not contempt. Almost respect, but grudging. Like she was the one person who kept nearly finding the right thread. She paused. "He said once, at dinner, that some people were dangerous not because they were smart, but because they refused to accept that a door was closed." "He meant that as a criticism," Silas said. "Yes. But it doesn't sound like one." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." The scrub country gave way to a long flat section broken by dry creek beds, the remnants of water that had once run freely here and didn't anymore. Silas knew this stretch. He'd ridden through it years ago when Miller Creek still reached this far, when the water table in this part of the territory was different. The change had been gradual, but it was visible if you'd seen how it used to be. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. They stopped briefly at mid-morning to rest the horses and eat something cold standing up. The way you do when stopping feels like a risk, but you know the animals need the break more than you need the momentum. "How far back do you think they are?" Eliza said. She was looking south down the trail, the way she'd been doing at regular intervals since they'd left Clara's. "If they're the same riders from yesterday morning and they stayed on the main trail looking for us, they're probably ahead of us now. Not behind." She turned to look at him. "That's worse." "That's worse," he agreed. "Bauer would have sent someone to the capital too," she said, "to wait, in case we somehow got through." "Yes." She chewed her bread and looked at the dry creek bed running alongside the trail. "We need to get Hollis before Bauer's man gets to her first." "Do you think Bauer would go after a lawyer?" She gave him a long look. "Right," he said. "Stupid question." "Bauer doesn't go after people openly," she said. "He doesn't have to. He has other methods. A word to the right person, a question raised about professional conduct, a suggestion to a landlord about a lease. My father has never needed violence to remove inconvenient people. He just adjusts the environment until staying becomes harder than leaving. That's what he did to the families. That's what he does to everyone." She finished her bread and dusted her hands on her coat. "Violence is expensive and visible. Paperwork is cheap and invisible." She mounted the mare. "Let's keep moving." They made good time through the middle of the day. Better than Silas had expected given the detour and the terrain. The horses had found their rhythm with each other, the gray setting the pace and the gelding matching it, and the two of them had fallen into the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, just the natural silence of people who'd been together long enough that they didn't need to fill space. It was around early afternoon when they came around a curve in the trail and found the horse. Just the one. Standing loose in the middle of the path, reins trailing, saddle still on but stirrups swinging empty. A solid bay with a white blaze, not a working horse but a good one, the kind that cost real money. Silas pulled up immediately. Eliza stopped behind him. He scanned the trail ahead, the scrub on both sides, the low rise to the east where the rock fell away in broken steps. "Stay here," he said quietly. Silas, stay here. He got down from the gelding and handed his reins to her and walked forward slowly, keeping his eyes moving. The bay horse watched him come without shying. Not a panicked animal, not spooked by something sudden. Just standing there, patient in the way horses are when they've decided humans are going to sort things out eventually. He checked the saddle. The rifle scabbard was empty, which meant whoever had been riding was armed. He checked the ground and found what he was looking for about 20 feet off the trail. A man sitting with his back against a rock, his left leg stretched out at a bad angle. Not Bauer. Not a hired man either, from the look of him. He was somewhere past 50, lean and weathered, wearing the coat of a working man, and he was holding his leg with both hands and trying not to show how much it hurt. He'd come off the horse on the rocks. From the angle of the leg, the ankle was either badly sprained or broken. "You got family nearby?" Silas asked. The man looked up at him with the specific wariness of someone who'd been sitting alone in pain for long enough to have imagined various versions of who might come down that trail. Silas apparently wasn't the worst version. "No," he said. "Riding to the capital." "So are we." Silas looked at the leg. "Can you put weight on it?" "Tried. Can't." "How long you been here?" "Since before dawn." The man's jaw tightened. He was embarrassed. You could see it fighting the pain for control of his face. "Horse shied at something in the dark and I went over on the rocks." Silas went back to the trail. "He's alone," he told Eliza. "Hurt ankle. He's been out here since before dawn." She was already getting down. She came forward and looked at the man with that same assessing attention she gave everything, and then she went to the bay horse and checked the saddlebag and came back with a strip of cloth that might have been a spare shirt at some point. "What's your name?" she asked, crouching next to the man. "Greer," he said. Both of them stopped. He looked from Eliza to Silas. "You know that name." "Clara Reimer mentioned you," Eliza said. She was very still. "You lost a mill 4 years ago." Something moved in the man's face. "You're the woman that woman sent word about," he said slowly. "She sent her neighbor's boy to my property yesterday morning. Said there was someone heading to the capital with testimony against Vale. Said if something was actually moving, I should—" He stopped, looked at her more carefully. "You're his daughter." "Yes." "And you're going to testify." "Yes." He looked at her for a long time, long enough that the pain in his leg clearly stopped being the main thing in his mind. "I've been sitting here for 8 hours, he said. "I thought I was going to die out here before I even got the chance to do anything useful." "You're not going to die," Eliza said. She started wrapping the ankle. "But this is broken, not sprained. You can't ride." "I can ride if you help me get on the horse." "Riding on a broken ankle for 3 days? Well, I've done worse," he said flatly. "I'm going to the capital. I'm going to be in that courthouse. I don't care what it costs me to get there." Eliza sat back on her heels and looked at him. Something passed between them. Not agreement exactly, but recognition. Two people who had been waiting for a long time to do something and weren't going to let a broken ankle or anything else stop them now. "We wrap it tight," she said. "You tell me if it starts going numb. We stop every 2 hours." She looked at him. "And you keep up." "I'll keep up," he said. Getting him back on the horse was not graceful. It took both of them and a fair amount of cursing from Greer and one aborted attempt that left him gasping against the bay's side before he collected himself and tried again. When he finally got seated, his face was gray and his hands on the reins were white-knuckled, but he was up. "Let's go," he said. They moved. 3 riders now instead of 2, which was more visible but also, Silas noted privately, more defensible if it came to that. Greer was taciturn by nature, it turned out, and not much altered by pain. He rode in silence, not complaining, keeping pace with a stubbornness that was almost admirable. Every 2 hours, as promised, they stopped and Eliza checked the wrapping and asked him how he felt, and he said fine, in exactly the way men say fine when they mean terrible but manageable. At the 3rd stop, Silas dug the last of his jerky out of his pack and divided it 3 ways without comment. Greer ate his portion and looked at Silas. "How did you end up in this?" he said. "Long story," Silas said. 3-day ride, Greer said. "We got time." So Silas told him. Not all of it. Not the parts about his father that still felt raw in ways he hadn't had time to process. But enough. The auction, the horses, Eliza following him north, the fence, the barn roof, the night she'd told him about the files. Greer listened without interrupting. She was at an auction, he said, when Silas finished. He said it like a man trying to fit something into a frame that didn't quite accommodate it. That's where I found her, Silas said. Greer looked at Eliza, who was watering the horses downstream and not part of this conversation. She's his daughter, he said. Vales. She is. And you trust her. Silas thought about it honestly. The fence, the barn roof, the notes inside his boot, the way she'd walked into Clara Reimer's house and said exactly who she was, no deflection, no softening. Yes, he said. I trust her. Greer chewed the last of his jerky. All right, he said. Like that settled something for him. They made camp that night in a stand of cottonwood trees near a shallow creek. It was better shelter than the night before. The trees broke the wind and the creek provided water, but the temperature had dropped further and the sky was fully overcast now. The kind of cloud cover that felt like snow was being considered. Silas took the first watch again. He sat against one of the larger cottonwoods with his rifle across his knees and listened to the dark. He heard Greer's breathing even out into sleep, which surprised him a little given the ankle. Either the man was more exhausted than he'd shown, or he had the particular gift of people who'd learned to sleep in uncomfortable situations, because the alternative was not sleeping at all. Eliza was quieter. He couldn't tell for a while whether she was asleep. Then she spoke from her blanket. You're not going to sleep at all tonight, are you? She said. I slept 2 hours last night. That's not enough. It's what's available. He watched the tree line. Go to sleep. I've been thinking about Margit Halse, she said, like sleep was an option she'd set aside for later. She tried twice. Both times she got shut down. The first time there was a procedural issue with how the evidence was filed. I think that was my father's doing, but I can't prove it. The second time the key witness withdrew, recanted. A pause. I've been thinking about what it must have been like for her, to build a case that carefully and then have it collapse because someone leaned on the wrong person. Or the right person, from your father's perspective. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. She kept practicing. She didn't leave the territory. She could have. A lot of lawyers, after that, would have gone somewhere that Vale didn't have reach. She stayed. Clara said she was waiting for a reason. Exactly. Eliza's voice was thoughtful. She's been building towards something. She just didn't have what she needed. A pause. I have what she needs, which is why we need to get there before Bauer's man adjusts her environment. Yes. He looked over at her. She was lying on her back, looking up at the cottonwood branches overhead, her coat pulled up around her chin, her eyes open. Try to sleep, he said. I'll try, she said, in a tone that suggested she didn't expect much from the attempt. She was asleep inside 10 minutes. He sat with the night and the cold and the sound of the horses breathing and thought about a man he'd never met named Cord Bauer, who was patient and missing the tip of a finger, and somewhere behind them or ahead of them on this same road. The snow didn't come that night, but it thought about it. The third day was harder. The terrain shifted in the early hours from flat scrub to a section of broken hill country. Not the limestone ridge drama of the first day, but a rolling, relentless climb and drop that wore at the horses and at Greer's ankle more than either showed openly. The overcast sky pressed down and the wind came from the north, with an edge to it that got inside your coat and stayed there. They were descending a long rocky switchback around mid-morning when Eliza pulled the mare up suddenly and put her hand out to the side, a gesture that meant stop without saying it. Silas stopped. Greer stopped behind him. She was looking east off the trail at a gap between two rock faces where a narrow path ran up into the hillside. He followed her gaze and didn't see anything. Then he did. A man on a horse up on the higher ground, sitting still, watching. He's not moving, Silas said quietly. No, Eliza said. He's been there for a while, Greer said from behind them, his voice low. That horse is resting its hip. That's an animal that's been standing in one place long enough to relax. The figure on the hill was too far away to make out clearly, but he was positioned exactly where someone who wanted to watch this section of trail would position himself, high enough for sight lines, close enough to the ridgeline that he'd be hard to spot unless you were looking. Bauer? Silas asked. I don't know, Eliza said. Maybe one of his men. She kept her eyes on the distant figure. We can't stop, and we can't go back. We keep moving, Silas said. Normal pace. We don't run. If we run, he knows we've seen him, Eliza said. If we run, he knows we're scared, Greer corrected. There's a difference. If he's already sent word ahead, it doesn't matter if we run or walk. What matters is what's waiting at the other end. Silas looked at the man on the hill, made a decision. We move, he said. Together, eyes forward. They moved. It was one of the stranger things he'd done, riding calmly down a switchback trail knowing there was someone on a hill above them watching every step, with no way to know what that person was going to do about what they were seeing. His shoulders were tight. He kept his hands relaxed on the reins because the gelding would feel tension, and he needed the horse steady. Eliza rode with her eyes on the trail. He could see her jaw set, could see the deliberate evenness of her breathing. Greer rode like a man who had already decided that what happened happened, and the most dignified response was to sit straight while it did. They made it around the next curve, and the man on the hill was out of sight. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Greer said, "Pick up the pace." They picked up the pace. The town of Seavers Crossing was 6 miles from the capital, and sat astride the main road like a knot in a rope. You couldn't get to the city without going through it or around it, and going around it added half a day on terrain that was rough enough at this time of year to be genuinely uncertain. Clara had mentioned it as a potential problem. The man who ran the livery in Seavers Crossing had a standing arrangement with various business interests in the region to report travelers matching certain descriptions. We don't stop, Silas said, when the town's outline came into view in the mid-afternoon. We need to water the horses, Eliza said. There's a creek south of town. We water before we enter. And if someone sees us on the creek road, we're travelers, that's all. We're 3 travelers, one of whom looks like he's been beat up by a mountain, Greer said mildly, referring to his own leg. People fall off horses, Silas said. It's not unusual. They watered at the creek and entered the town at a walk. Silas kept his hat down and his pace deliberate, not hurrying, not dawdling, just moving through. Eliza kept the mare between herself and the livery stable they passed on the main street. Greer sat straight on the bay and looked at no one in particular. They made it through without incident, which Silas didn't fully trust until they were a mile out on the other side. That was too easy, Eliza said. Maybe it was fine, Greer said. It wasn't fine, she said. Someone in that town clocked us. I saw a man come out of the general store and look at us for about 10 seconds longer than you look at people who are just passing through. Silas had seen him too. Hadn't said anything. So they know we're a day out, he said. They know we're half a day out, she said. If they send a fast rider tonight, then Bauer has word that we're close and hasn't stopped us yet, Silas said, which means either he thinks he can stop us at the capital or he's letting us come because he wants to see who we talk to. He wants to know if we have contacts inside the capital, Eliza said. She'd clearly been running this calculation already. He knows I have information. He doesn't know how much. He doesn't know about Halls. She paused. If he did, he'd have moved harder already. Then we have one advantage, Silas said. We know what he doesn't know. They camped that night with the lights of the capital visible on the horizon. Not close, not safe, but present in a way that felt different from the abstract goal they'd been riding toward for 3 days. Real now, specific. The particular darkness that sits between where you are and where you need to be. Greer's ankle had swollen badly. He hadn't said so, but Eliza had checked it at the last stop and her expression had been enough. He ate supper without complaint and lay down with his boot off and his coat over the ankle and was asleep before Silas finished his coffee. He's going to struggle tomorrow, Eliza said quietly. He'll manage, Silas said. He's been managing all day. His ankle might be worse than broken. It might be shattered. He needs a doctor. He knows that. He made his choice. She looked at the distant lights. We need to go to Hall first, she said, before the courthouse. If Bauer's men are watching the courthouse, and they will be, we need to establish contact with Halls first so she knows we're coming and can be ready to move immediately when we present the testimony. How do we find her without asking someone who might report it? Clara gave me her street address, Eliza said. She tapped her head. I have it. Of course you do. She glanced at him. You think I'm annoying, she said, remembering everything. I think it saved our lives about 3 times in the last 4 days, he said. I don't find that annoying. She looked back at the lights. The wind moved her hair and she pushed it back impatiently. When we get to the Capitol, she said, when I sit down with Halls and start going through what I know, it's going to be a long time before it's over. The testimony, the investigation, the legal proceedings. She was quiet for a moment. Your ranch is going to sit empty all that time. I know. That bothers you. Some. He looked at the fire. But it's still there. Whatever happens, the land doesn't go anywhere. My father will try to accelerate anything he has pending on land in the region, she said. Once the investigation starts, he'll know the clock is running. He might try to push through deals quickly. Including anything on my property? I don't know. She said it honestly, which he appreciated more than reassurance would have been. There's nothing in the files I saw specifically about your land, but that might mean there was nothing pending, or it might mean it was in a file I didn't see. He nodded slowly. Thought about the 400 acres and the fence line and the barn with its new roof section. Thought about his father sitting in that kitchen writing a letter to a bank officer, while somewhere in a different office a man wrote the word resolved and moved on. Then we move faster, he said. Morning came cold and clear, the overcast finally breaking overnight, and they were moving before the sun was fully above the horizon. The Capitol was half a day's ride. The road widened as they got closer, other travelers joining the route at regular intervals. Farm wagons, a postal rider going the opposite direction, a family in a heavy wagon with their possessions stacked under oilcloth, moving toward the city the way people move toward cities when the territory has used them up. They blended in. That was something. But 2 hours from the city, at a place where the road curved around a long bend and the trees pressed close on the north side, 3 riders came out of the trees and blocked the trail. Not Reed Holt's men, not local hired muscle. These were different, dressed well for working men, horses in good condition, positioned with a deliberateness that said they'd been waiting, not passing through. The man in the front was tall, heavy through the shoulders. His left hand held his reins loosely, and Silas could see, even at this distance, that the index finger wasn't quite the right length. Cord Bauer. He stopped his horse in the middle of the road and looked at them. He had the particular stillness of a man who never moved more than he needed to, who had learned that patience was a form of power. His expression was the expression of someone doing a job, nothing more personal than that. Miss Vale, he said. His voice was level and without accent. Your father would like you to come home. Eliza sat on the mare and said nothing. The man with you, Bauer said, looking at Silas, doesn't have a stake in this. He can ride on. He has considerable stake in this, Eliza said. Her voice was steady in a way that Silas suspected cost her something. Bauer looked at her for a moment, then at Silas, then at Greer, taking inventory. The information you're carrying, Bauer said to Eliza. Whatever you think you have, it's incomplete. You saw portions of your father's records. You don't understand the context. I understand the context fine, she said. Courts require more than a daughter's memory of papers she looked at once. I looked at them more than once, she said. I read them carefully. I have dates, names, and the specific language of documents I can recite verbatim. Enough for an investigator to know exactly where to look and what to ask for. A pause. You know that. That's why you're here. Bauer was quiet for a moment. Then, your father has made arrangements to compensate various families for situations that may have developed unfavorably. He's prepared to be reasonable. He's prepared to be reasonable now that someone's coming for him, Eliza said. That's not the same as being reasonable. It produces the same outcome for the families. It produces money, she said. It doesn't produce accountability. He does it again to the next 11 families, or the next 20. Her voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was somehow more effective. I'm not going home, Bauer. Move aside. Bauer looked at her for a long time, long enough that one of the men behind him shifted in his saddle and the movement was visible. Then he looked at Silas. You got any idea what you've walked into? He said. There was something almost conversational about it, like a man genuinely curious. Getting clearer every day, Silas said. She's going to cost you everything, Bauer said. Whatever you've got. Whatever you think you're protecting. Men who cross Gideon Vale don't generally come out with more than they started with. I started with $23 and 2 horses nobody wanted, Silas said. There's not a lot of distance between that and nothing. Something crossed Bauer's face. Not quite amusement. The nearest thing to it that a man like Bauer allowed himself. He moved his horse to the side of the road. Not all the way. Just enough to create a gap that was navigable, but uncomfortable. A message in the geometry of it. We're letting you through, not because we have to, but because we're choosing to, and we want you to know the difference. The capital's 2 hours east, Bauer said. You'll be there by noon. Silas kept his eyes forward. Eliza, he said quietly, move. She moved. He moved with her. Greer came behind. They rode past Bauer and his men with the road barely wide enough. Silas close enough to the big man that he could hear his horse breathing. He felt the attention on the back of his neck like something physical. He did not turn around. He listened for hoofbeats behind them. None came. When they'd rounded the next bend and the trees closed the view behind them, he heard Eliza exhale, long and slow, like she'd been holding it since Bauer's horse stepped into the road. He let us go, Greer said. His voice was careful. He let us go, Eliza agreed. She didn't sound relieved, which means he either has something waiting at the Capitol or my father gave him instructions we don't know about. Your father knows we're coming now, Silas said. He knew we were coming before Bauer found us. She looked at him. My father doesn't stop things. He redirects them. Bauer blocking the road isn't the move. The move is whatever happens when we get to the Capitol. Silas thought about that as they rode. About a man who built an empire on the principle that paperwork was cheaper than violence and redirection was more effective than confrontation. About the particular danger of an opponent who thought 3 moves ahead and preferred that you never saw the game you were playing until it was over. The Capitol's rooftops appeared above the tree line ahead of them, sharp against the cold blue sky. 2 hours. Whatever was waiting for them, the time for preparation was done. The Capitol was bigger than Silas remembered it. He'd been here twice in his life, once as a boy with his father, once at 22 on cattle business that hadn't gone particularly well, and both times the city had felt like a place that was happening too fast. Too many people moving in too many directions with too much certainty about where they were headed. It felt the same now, except he was older and more tired and riding in with a broken-ankled mill owner on one side, and a woman who was about to bring down the most powerful man in 3 territories on the other, which added a particular texture to the experience. They came in on the East Road, which fed into the wider commercial streets before the administrative district, and Silas kept them moving at a steady walk. Not slow enough to look like they were hiding, not fast enough to draw the eye. The horses needed rest badly. He needed rest badly. Greer's face, in his peripheral vision, had the gray-green pallor of a man who had been outrunning pain for 3 days and was starting to lose the race. Hall's office first, Eliza said quietly from his left. You said that already. I'm saying it again because when we get into the city and there are people and buildings and distractions, I want us to be agreed about the sequence before anything else makes it complicated. He glanced at her. She was watching the street with that scanning attention, the same pattern she'd maintained since they left the ranch. Sides, ahead, behind, sides again. She hadn't stopped moving her eyes in 4 days. Hollis first, he confirmed. Then what? If Hollis is willing, and I believe she will be, she'll file for an emergency judicial hearing. There's a procedure for that when material testimony is at risk. It bypasses the normal schedule and gets you in front of a judge quickly, sometimes same day. She paused. I researched this 6 months ago when I was planning this. I memorized the procedure. Of course you did. If we can get in front of Judge Aldrin. Who's Aldrin? Federal Circuit Judge. He's been on the bench for 11 years. He presided over the Kelman fraud case in '84, which involved similar document manipulation, land records, false surveys. He knows what to look for. She said it with the specificity of someone who'd been through court records she had no official business reading. He's also the one judge in this district that my father has never done business with, directly or indirectly. You checked? I checked, she said, not apologetic about it. Greer from the Bay Horse said, "You're going to be very useful in that courtroom." "I'm going to be useful before we even get there," she said. Margaret Hollis's office was on a side street 3 blocks from the main administrative buildings. Not a prestigious address, not the kind of location a lawyer with wealthy clients would choose, but practical in the way that spoke of someone who cared about being accessible rather than impressive. The sign on the door was small. The door itself needed paint. A window on the street level showed lamplight even in the afternoon, which meant someone was working. Eliza got down from the mare before Silas had fully stopped and went to the door and knocked. A pause. Footsteps. The door opened. The woman who opened it was somewhere in her mid-40s, with brown hair going gray at the temples and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She was wearing a working dress with ink on the cuff of the right sleeve. She looked at Eliza with the quick assessment of someone who read people efficiently and had learned to trust her first reading. "Yes," she said. "My name is Eliza Voss," Eliza said. "My father is Gideon Vale. I need to speak with you." The woman, Hollis, didn't change expression, didn't react the way most people reacted to that name. She just opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "All of you." Inside was exactly what the outside had suggested. Functional, organized, the office of a working lawyer rather than a prosperous one. Papers in careful stacks, a desk with 2 chairs facing it, shelves of bound documents that had the look of things that had been referenced many times. On one wall, a large hand-drawn map of the territory with marks on it that Silas, looking at it, recognized as property boundaries. Eliza saw the map at the same moment he did. "You've been tracking the land patterns," Eliza said. "For 7 years," Halls said. She sat behind her desk and looked at Eliza steadily. "I know who you are. I know your father. Tell me why you're here and what you have." Eliza told her. It took 40 minutes. Hall didn't interrupt once. She had a notepad in front of her and a pen in her hand, and she wrote steadily, asking no questions, just recording. But Silas could see from her handwriting, from the speed of it, and the way she occasionally underlined without breaking her attention from Eliza's face, that she wasn't transcribing. She was evaluating. Every fact that Eliza produced, Halls was running against something she already had. When Eliza finished, Halls looked at her notepad for a moment. "The Reimer water rights," she said. "You said there's a recorded transaction in your father's personal files showing the banknote was purchased 6 weeks before the debt was called." 6 weeks and 3 days, Eliza said. "The note was dated the 14th. The debt acceleration was the 17th of the following month." "I have the debt acceleration on record," Halls said. "I never had the note purchase." She paused. "You can testify to the date and the document's contents." "Verbatim," Eliza said. "I read it 4 times. Halls looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Silas. "And you're the Cain family." "My father was," Silas said. "I've been trying to hold what was left." "The Miller Creek water rights," Halls said. "I have that file. I couldn't establish how the court documents were altered without an original to compare against." She turned back to Eliza. "You saw the original." "And the correspondence authorizing the alteration," Eliza said, "including the name of the court clerk who was paid." Hollis put her pen down. For the first time, something shifted in her face. Not quite emotion, more like the expression of a person who has been pushing against a locked door for a very long time and has just felt it give. She took her spectacles off and rubbed the bridge of her nose and sat very still for a moment. Then she put the spectacles back on. "I'm going to file for an emergency judicial hearing this afternoon," she said, "with Judge Aldrin." She looked at Eliza. "I need you to understand what that means. Once I file, your father will know within hours. Whatever protection obscurity has given you up to this point is gone. I lost that protection on the road into town, Eliza said. Bauer found us. He let us through. Halls went still. Bauer let you through? Yes. That's not like Gideon Vale, Halls said. She wasn't talking to them anymore. She was thinking out loud. Vale doesn't let things reach the courthouse. He stops them before. Bauer letting you through means... She stopped. It means my father is planning something inside the courthouse, Eliza said. Not on the road. He's changed the game. He's had time to prepare, Halls said. He knew you were coming. Not the details, but he knew his daughter had information and was heading this direction. He's had days. She was quiet for a moment. There's a man on the district court staff, clerk named Whitmore. I've suspected for 2 years that he reports to someone connected to Vale's operation. I've never been able to prove it. If Whitmore is in Vale's pocket, Eliza said, he can delay processing the hearing request or route it to a different judge. Yes, Halls said, which is why I'm not filing through the standard clerk's process. She stood up. I have a direct channel to Aldrin's judicial secretary. It's not procedure, but it'll work. She was already moving to the door of a back room, and she said over her shoulder, There's a doctor 2 streets over. His name is Finch. Tell him Margaret sent you. He'll look at... She glanced at Greer. Whatever that is. Broken ankle, Greer said. Broken ankle, she repeated, without breaking stride. The man on the bay horse needs to be functional enough to testify as a supporting witness if Aldrin requests corroboration. Get it looked at. She disappeared into the back room. Silas looked at Eliza. Eliza looked at him. She already had half of it, she said, quietly, like something she was still absorbing. She had the shape of it, he said. You have the substance. They took Greer to the doctor, a brisk, competent man named Finch, who confirmed that the ankle was broken in 2 places, wrapped it with the efficiency of someone who'd seen worse and had opinions about people who'd ridden on it for 3 days, and provided a crutch improvised from a wood dowel and some leather padding that was ugly but functional. Greer paid him with money he'd apparently been carrying in an inside pocket the entire journey and said not a word about it until they were back on the street. I was saving it for the capital, he said when Eliza looked at him. Didn't know what I'd need it for. Turns out, a crutch. They left the horses at a livery 2 blocks from Hall's office, the gray mare and the gelding, who had earned the decent feed and the rest more than any horses Silas had seen recently, and went back to wait. Hollis returned an hour later. Aldrin will hear it, she said. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. He's canceling 2 other matters to accommodate it. She sat back down at her desk and looked at Eliza. We have tonight to prepare your testimony, properly, in a format the judge can follow and that will hold up when Vale's lawyers challenge it. His lawyers will be there tomorrow? Eliza said. His lawyers will be there tonight, Holmes said. Someone will have notified his people the moment I filed. He'll have representation in place by morning, and they will be very good because he only hires very good people. She looked at Eliza without flinching. They're going to try to discredit you. Your memory, your motives, your relationship with your father. They'll suggest you're unstable. They'll suggest this is a personal grievance dressed up as public interest testimony. They'll suggest that a daughter with reason to be angry at a father is not a credible witness. I know, Eliza said. Are you prepared for that? I've been prepared for that for 6 months, Eliza said. I didn't expect this to be comfortable. Hollis looked at her for a moment, then she said, Good, let's start. Silas and Greer were useful for approximately the first hour of the preparation session and then became furniture. It was nothing personal. Hollis and Eliza had found a working rhythm that required neither of them and actively didn't need the interruption. A back and forth of question and answer and refinement that was so fast and so specific that sitting in on it felt like watching 2 people converse in a language you almost but didn't quite speak. Hollis would cite a case. Eliza would apply her testimony to it. Hollis would identify where the gaps were. Eliza would find the detail that filled the gap or acknowledge honestly where the gap remained. They built a structure out of this process, piece by piece, that was neither Hollis's 7 years of documented patterns nor Eliza's 4 years of observed detail, but some third thing that was stronger than either alone. Silas sat in the corner of the office and watched and felt the particular satisfaction of seeing something you've helped carry finally get set down somewhere solid. He also felt tired. Bone deep, 4 days of hard riding tired. He fell asleep in the chair sometime around 9 o'clock. He woke up to Eliza shaking his shoulder. The lamp was lower. The clock on Hall's wall said 20 past 11. She has a back room, Eliza said. A cot. She says you should use it. What about you? I have more to go through with her. Eliza. I'm fine, she said. I'll sleep when it's ready. He looked at her. The tiredness was there, and the fine lines around her eyes, and the way she was holding herself with a deliberateness that said the posture was conscious effort rather than natural ease. But there was something else, too, an aliveness. The particular energy of someone doing the thing they've been building toward for a long time. Don't be stupid about it, he said. I'm never stupid about anything, she said, which was both the most and least accurate thing she'd said in 4 days. He went to the cot. He slept. He dreamed about the ranch, which surprised him, not about the Capitol or the courthouse or Bower on the road, just the ranch, the south pasture fence in the early morning, the gray mare moving along the fence line with her one good eye watching the ground. The ordinary thing, the thing that existed before any of this and would still be thereafter. He woke at 6, washed his face at the basin in the back room, and came out to find Eliza at the desk with a cup of cold coffee and 40 pages of organized notes in front of her and the calm expression of someone who had finally set down something heavy. Did you sleep? He said. 2 hours. That's not enough. You told me that 4 days ago, she said. I managed. Halls arrived back at 7. She'd gone home for a few hours at some point, apparently, and returned with a clean dress and a sharpness in her eyes that said she'd slept better than either of them. She looked at Eliza's notes, asked 3 questions, made 2 corrections, and declared them ready. Greer appeared at 7:30 on his improvised crutch, wearing a cleaner version of the same coat and looking like a man who had decided that broken bones were a reasonable price for what he was about to do. They walked to the courthouse. It was a cold morning, clear, the kind of clarity that comes after long cloud cover has finally broken. The administrative building sat at the top of a slight rise above the commercial district, and the courthouse itself was the largest of them. Stone-faced, solid, the architecture of a place built to outlast the arguments conducted inside it. There were people on the steps, too many people for 8 in the morning. Silas saw it before he understood it. A cluster of men near the main door, some in professional dress, one that he recognized after a moment as a territorial marshal's deputy, and behind them a larger group that was harder to categorize. Vale's lawyers, Hollis said, not breaking stride. The ones in the back aren't lawyers, Eliza said. She was right. The back group was different. Older men, mostly, working clothes, the look of people who had traveled. Silas counted 7, then more as they got closer. Then one of them turned, and he recognized the face. Clara Reimer. She'd ridden through the night. She was standing on the courthouse steps in her good coat, the one she'd have kept for occasions, and she was talking to 2 other people Silas didn't recognize. As Eliza came up the steps, Clara turned and looked at her directly. I sent word to 6 other families, Clara said, without preamble. 3 of them came. She gestured at the people around her. The others sent written statements. I have them here. Eliza stopped on the steps. For the first time in 4 days, maybe longer, she looked genuinely unprepared for something. Not overwhelmed, just surprised by it, the way you're surprised when something you stopped expecting still happens. You rode through the night, Eliza said. The road's not bad once you know it, Clara said, which was almost certainly a lie, told without hesitation. One of the men beside Clara stepped forward. Late 60s, work-worn hands, the build of someone who'd run heavy equipment most of his life. Patton, he said. My wife passed 4 years back. She'd spent 3 years trying to get someone to listen. I'd like to be here when they do. Another man, younger, with his hat in his hands. Gaines. My father lost 40 acres of bottomland in 81. The lawyers told us there was nothing to be done. Silas looked at Eliza. She was looking at the people on the steps with an expression he hadn't seen on her face before. Not the watchful calculation, not the managed stillness. Something raw, something that was trying to process what it meant that these people had come. "We should go in," Halls said gently. "We have 12 minutes." They went in. The courtroom was smaller than Silas had imagined. A working room rather than a grand one, wood-paneled, with benches for observers and a long table for testimony. Vale's legal team was already seated on one side. 3 men, all in dark coats, with the composed, expensive look of lawyers who had been hired specifically because they were very good at making other people seem unreliable. Silas sat in the observer section with Greer and Clara and the others from the steps. Hollis and Eliza went to the testimony table. Hollis laid out her documents. Eliza sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her, the same way she'd sat at his kitchen table 4 nights ago when she told him his family's land hadn't been lost. It had been taken. Judge Aldrin came in at 8:05. He was older than Silas had pictured, past 70, thin, with the careful movement of a man who was aware of his own age but refused to let it run the proceedings. He sat, looked at both sides of the room, looked at the observer section with the slight surprise of someone who hadn't expected that many people on a matter filed just yesterday, and looked at his papers. "This is an emergency testimonial hearing," he said, "requested by counsel Hollis on behalf of a material witness. The subject is alleged systemic fraud in land and water rights transactions throughout the territory over a period of approximately 15 years. He looked up. Vale legal team is present in a monitoring capacity. This is a testimonial hearing, not a trial. The purpose today is to establish the credibility and scope of the testimony for determination of whether a full judicial investigation is warranted." He looked at Eliza. "You're the witness." "Yes, Your Honor." "State your name and your relationship to the subject of the testimony." "Eliza Voss. Gideon Vale is my father." A murmur in the room from the observer section. Aldrin didn't react to it. "You understand," he said, "the testimony given in this proceeding is under oath, and that false testimony carries criminal penalty." "I understand." "You understand that your relationship to the subject creates a conflict of interest that the court will be required to weigh." "I understand that too," she said. "The testimony I'm going to give can be corroborated by documents in my father's personal files, by corresponding records in the county court system, and by the independent accounts of people present in this room today. My relationship to the subject doesn't change what the documents say." Aldrin looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Begin." She began. Silas had been there for every conversation. He'd heard her lay it out for Halls, had heard the shape of it in fragments across 4 days of writing, but hearing it delivered in a courtroom, under oath, in the flat, deliberate language of someone who has organized their knowledge for maximum clarity, it was different. She didn't perform it, that was the thing. She didn't reach for emotion or drama. She gave dates and names and document contents and the specific language of correspondence she'd read and retained, and she built it the way you build a fence, post by post, wire by wire, until the structure was visible and obvious and could hold weight. Vale's lawyers objected 3 times in the first 30 minutes. Aldrin sustained none of them. The 4th objection, raised when Eliza cited the name of the court clerk who'd been paid to alter the Cain family's survey documents, came from the lead lawyer, a man named Prescott, who had the silvered confidence of someone accustomed to controlling rooms. "Objection," Prescott said. "The witness is citing memory of alleged documents she claims to have read on unspecified occasions while in her father's private residence without authorization. This is hearsay compounded by trespass." "I was in my father's study as an invited member of the household," Eliza said before Halls could respond. "I organized his business records on his behalf for 3 years. The documents I'm citing were in the files I organized. I read them in the ordinary course of that work." The witness had no legal standing to. "The witness was not under obligation to ignore what she read," Halls said, "and her memory of those documents can be corroborated by the actual documents, which are in your client's files and subject to subpoena once this court determines that an investigation is warranted." Aldrin looked at Prescott over his glasses. "Overruled," he said. "Continue." It went on for 2 hours. In the middle of the second hour, Prescott changed tactics. He stopped objecting to the evidence and started on Eliza herself. Her motives, her history, her mental state, the suggestion introduced carefully and with plausible deniability that a daughter estranged from a powerful father might have reason to distort her recollections in ways that served a personal agenda. Eliza sat through it without moving. When Prescott finished his line of questioning with the particular satisfied pause of a man who believes he's planted enough doubt to contaminate whatever follows, Eliza looked at him. "You've asked me about my motives," she said. "I'll tell you what they are. I sat in my father's study and I read a letter from a man named Cain who was begging a bank officer to look at his documents because something had gone wrong and he didn't understand how, and at the bottom of that letter, in my father's handwriting, was the word resolved." She paused. "That man spent the rest of his life believing he had failed his family. His son spent 15 years trying to save what was left. What I read was not a business record. It was evidence that my father destroyed a man and documented his satisfaction about it in a single word." She looked at Prescott. "You want to know my motive? That's my motive." The room was very quiet. In the observer section, Silas sat with his hands on his knees and his jaw tight and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. He just sat with it, the way you sit with something that finally has a clear shape after years of fog. Prescott said nothing for a moment. Then he looked at his papers. "No further questions." Halls rose. "The observers in this courtroom include 3 individuals who can provide first-hand corroboration of separate incidents described in the testimony. I'd ask the court's permission to enter written statements from 3 additional parties who could not be present today." Aldrin looked at the observer section, at Clara Reimer sitting straight in her good coat, at Patton with his work-worn hands, at Gaines holding his hat. "The court accepts the written statements," Aldrin said, "and I'll hear brief corroborating testimony from the 3 present parties before I make a determination." He looked at his clerk, not Whitmore, a young woman Silas hadn't noticed before who had been seated to Aldrin's left the whole time. "Note the time." It was past 10 in the morning. Greer testified from the observer bench because the crutch made the walk to the testimony table complicated, and Aldrin allowed it without comment. He was brief and specific: dates, property records, the precise sequence of legal proceedings that had taken his mill. Clara Reimer followed, with the flat precision of a woman who had been rehearsing her statement in her head for 4 years. Gaines was shorter, more emotional at points, which Silas had the impression Halls had anticipated because she didn't try to manage it, just let it stand for what it was: an honest account from someone who hadn't planned to be eloquent. When it was done, Aldrin called a recess. He came back 20 minutes later. "I'm authorizing a full judicial investigation into the allegations presented today," he said, "including the issuance of a record subpoena for all relevant documentation held by Gideon Vale and associated business entities. The witness," he looked at Eliza, "will be placed under court protection for the duration of the investigation." He looked at Prescott. "Counsel is advised that any interference with the witness or with the court's investigative process will be treated as obstruction." He looked at his papers. "This court will reconvene in 30 days for a status report on document production." He stood. Everyone stood. Then he was gone. The room started moving again. Papers, voices, Halls turning to Eliza with something in her face that wasn't quite triumph, but was the nearest she'd allow herself to it. Prescott and his colleagues gathered their things with the precise movements of men who had already started calculating the next phase. Silas sat in the observer section for a moment before getting up. Greer was next to him, the crutch propped against the bench, his ankle out in front of him. He looked at Silas. "That's done then," he said. "The start of it," Silas said. "The start of it," Greer agreed. He didn't sound disappointed by that. He sounded like a man who'd been waiting to start something for 4 years and had finally run out of reasons to wait. In the front of the room, Eliza was talking to Hollis, focused, technical, already moving to whatever came next, the way she did everything. But when Silas stood and came down the aisle toward her, she looked up and stopped mid-sentence. He wasn't sure what his face was doing. He didn't try to manage it. "Resolved," he said, quietly. She looked at him. Something moved in her eyes, complicated and quick. And for a moment she didn't have the watchful management in place, just whatever was actually there underneath it. "Not yet," she said, "but moving." "Moving is enough," he said. Halls was speaking again, pulling Eliza's attention back to logistics, protection arrangements, the next steps in the legal process, the question of where Eliza would stay during the investigation. Outside the courthouse, somewhere in the city, Gideon Vale was receiving word of what had just happened. Cordbauer was adjusting his calculations. Prescott was calling his client. The machine that had run uninterrupted for 30 years had just felt something catch in its gears. Silas walked out of the courtroom into the cold, bright morning and stood on the stone steps and looked at the city below the rise and thought about his father, about a letter, about one word written at the bottom of it by a man who had not expected to be accountable for what he'd done. Clara Reimer came and stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. "You think it'll hold?" she asked finally. "I think Eliza Voss has been carrying this for 4 years, and she knows every detail of it cold," he said. "And I think Margaret Hollis has been building toward this for 7. Between the two of them," he stopped. "Yes, I think it'll hold." Clara was quiet. Then, "I buried my husband 2 years ago. He never stopped believing someone would eventually listen." Silas looked at her. "He was right," he said. She pressed her lips together, nodded once, went back inside. He stood on the steps for another few minutes in the cold. Behind him, the courthouse was full of motion, testimony and lawyers, and the grinding first movements of something that had needed to move for a very long time. Below him, the city went about its morning. Somewhere behind him, he heard the courthouse door open and footsteps on the stone, and without turning, he knew it was Eliza. She came and stood beside him, didn't say anything, just stood there, which was something he'd noticed she did. She didn't fill silences that didn't need filling. After a while, he said, "How long before your father's lawyers file a challenge to the investigation authorization?" "Today," she said, "by this afternoon." "And Aldrin?" "Will deny it," she said. "He'll have anticipated it. He spent 20 minutes in that recess deciding. That's enough time for a man who knows what he's doing to prepare for the immediate response." He nodded. "It's going to be months," she said. "The investigation, the document production. If it goes to trial, I know." "Your ranch is still there," he said. "It was there yesterday. It'll be there tomorrow." He looked at the city. "The horses need another week of rest before they can make the trip back." The gray's eye was bothering her on the last day. Eliza was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how long I'll need to stay," she said. "For the investigation? They need me available for the document review, for additional testimony. It could be—" "I know," he said. "I'll go back once the horses are rested. Come back when you need to." She turned to look at him. "Come back." "For the trial," he said, "if it gets that far." He looked at her. "And it's going to get that far." She looked at him for a moment. And there it was again. That thing that happened in her face when she wasn't managing it. The complicated, honest thing behind the watchfulness. "The fence is fixed," she said finally. "The barn roof, too." "I noticed," he said. "Good work." "The rest of it is going to take longer." "Yes," he said. He turned back toward the courthouse door. "Usually does." They went back inside. Silas rode back to the ranch alone. He'd expected that to feel like retreat. It didn't exactly, but it didn't feel clean either. It felt like the particular suspension of a man who has set something large in motion and now has to go home and wait for the sound of it landing, which is its own kind of hard. The horses were rested. The gray mare's eye had settled. Whatever irritation the trail had caused had cleared with a week of decent feed and no demands. And the gelding moved without any favoring of his hip at all, which was the best argument Silas had seen in a while for what rest and feed could do for something that looked like it was past saving. Eliza had stood in front of the livery when he left, not making a production of it, just standing there in the coat she'd borrowed from Hall's, which fit badly across the shoulders, with her hands at her sides and that level look she gave things she was taking seriously. "I'll send word when the document subpoena produces results," she said. "Hollis thinks 4 to 6 weeks before Vale's lawyers exhaust the delay strategies, and the records have to be produced." "Write when you can," he said. "I will." She paused. "The ranch will be there," he said. "It always is." She nodded. He started the gelding moving. He'd gone about 30 yards when she said his name. He stopped and looked back. She was still standing in front of the livery, the coat wrong on her shoulders, the city morning moving around her. "Thank you," she said. "For the fence. I know that's not what you were thanking me for, but the fence and the barn. I needed to do something useful while I was deciding whether to trust you. It helped me think." "Fixed fence helped me too," he said. She almost smiled. The real one, the small guarded one that had been showing up more frequently in the last few days. He rode north. The trip back was easier in every practical sense. 2 horses he knew now, a route he'd traveled, no one following. But it was lonelier than the trip out, which surprised him. He'd spent most of his adult life working alone on a ranch that didn't have enough hands, and solitude had never bothered him much before. He wasn't sure what to make of the fact that it bothered him now. He got back to the ranch on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, which was a relief and a problem simultaneously. The same things that had needed doing before were still needing doing, and he'd been gone 10 days and the work had accumulated the way work does when nobody's doing it. He started with the horses, then the barn, then the fencing on the north pasture that he'd been meaning to check since October and hadn't, and it turned out one section needed 2 new posts, which he dug in the cold ground with the particular stubbornness of a man who is tired and working anyway because the alternative is sitting inside thinking. He thought anyway, while he worked. About his father. Mostly about his father. He'd spent years with a version of his father's story that he'd carried without examining, the way you carry an old injury that stopped actively hurting long ago, and so you stop thinking of it as an injury and just think of it as the way you walk now. His father had borrowed wrong. His father had trusted wrong. His father had made decisions that a better businessman wouldn't have made, and the result was that the family had lost 300 acres and the water rights to Miller Creek. And by the time the court sorted it out, his father was a smaller man than he'd been before, and never got larger again. That was the story. The story was wrong. His father had filed the correct documents. His father had written to the bank officer because something was wrong, and he was trying to find out what. His father had been right about everything except the fundamental nature of what was happening to him, which was that it wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't bad luck, and it wasn't his failure. It was deliberate. It was purchased. A man had looked at his family's land and his family's water and decided he wanted it and had used enough money and enough influence to arrange the legal system into the shape he needed. And his father had spent the rest of his life believing he had failed. Silas drove the second post into the cold ground with more force than was strictly necessary. He didn't cry about it. He wasn't built that way, and he didn't pretend otherwise. But he stayed out past dark that evening, working by lantern light on a fence that could have waited until morning because the work was a place to put the feeling that didn't have a clean name. The grief that was also anger, that was also something close to love for a man who had carried a lie for 30 years and never knew it was a lie. He went inside eventually. He made coffee. He sat at the same table where Eliza had told him all of it 10 days ago, in the lamplight with the wind against the house. He thought, she chose this. She had a life. Complicated, constrained, the life of a woman under the thumb of a powerful man's will. But a life. And she walked out of it. She walked out with nothing but what was in her memory, and what was in her memory turned out to be enough. There was something in that worth sitting with. The letter came 5 weeks later. Not from Eliza. From Hall's. 3 pages, dense and precise, the handwriting of a woman who wrote quickly and expected you to keep up. The document subpoena had produced results. Vale's lawyers had exhausted their procedural delays and the court had compelled production. Among the records produced, the original file on the Cain family land dispute, including the correspondence authorizing the alteration of survey documents and the name of the bank officer who had been paid. The clerk who had altered the court records had been identified and was cooperating with the investigation in exchange for a reduced charge. 7 of the 11 families Eliza had identified were now formally part of the investigation, with 4 others pending confirmation of evidentiary standing. Halls wrote, near the end, Miss Voss has been an extraordinary resource throughout this process. Her memory for detail and her understanding of the operational structure has compressed what would have been years of investigative work into weeks. Judge Aldrin has remarked twice in chambers that he has rarely encountered a witness whose testimony was both so extensive and so precisely corroborated by the documentary record. The last paragraph was short. Trial date has been set for the spring. Miss Voss has asked me to tell you that the gray mare's eye is something that can probably be managed long-term with a simple treatment she learned from a horse handler in the capital, and she will explain it when she has the opportunity. He read that last paragraph twice. He wrote back that same evening. To Hollis, formally, confirming his availability to testify, and then a separate shorter letter to the address Hollis had included at the bottom of the page that said, "The north pasture fence is fixed. The barn roof held through 2 hard rains. The gray mare would appreciate the information about her eye whenever convenient." He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. The winter was hard in the particular way of winters when you're working a property alone. Not desperate. Not the kind of hard that breaks things. Just relentless and unglamorous. One thing after another requiring attention in the cold. He managed. He'd been managing alone for years. But he noticed, more than he had before, the specific texture of the silence in the house in the evenings, and he didn't try to talk himself out of noticing it. Letters came irregularly when the mail rider's route allowed. Eliza wrote the way she did everything, efficiently and without excess, but not without feeling. She described the investigation's progress with the same precise attention she'd given to fence posts and barn roofs and court testimony, and occasionally, in the margins or at the end, she said something that wasn't about the case. She wrote once, "The capital is a city that thinks very highly of itself. I have been here 3 months, and I do not yet find it interesting. I find it useful, which is different." She wrote another time. Greer testified last week. His ankle is apparently healing well enough. He told the court about the mill for 40 minutes without notes. One of Vale's lawyers tried to suggest his memory was unreliable. Greer looked at him for about 5 seconds and then repeated, verbatim, the exact language of the legal proceeding that had been used to take his property in 1881. The lawyer did not follow up. That one made Silas smile for the first time in a while. Spring came slowly, as it does in that part of the country, grudging and incremental, a degree of warmth at a time, the ground softening from the outside in. The gray mare's eye responded to the treatment Eliza had described in a follow-up letter, a simple rinse applied twice daily that reduced the irritation enough that she moved with noticeably more confidence on her offside. The gelding had filled out over winter. Both horses were better than the animals he'd brought home from the auction, which were better than the animals anyone else had wanted that day. He kept thinking about that, about what other people's discard looked like when you gave it decent conditions and time. He left for the capital 2 weeks before the trial date. He stayed at a boarding house Hollis had recommended, a practical place without pretension run by a woman named Mrs. Alt, who had opinions about meal times that she enforced with the cheerful absolutism of someone who had long ago decided that flexibility in this area only caused problems. He didn't mind. After a winter of making his own meals at irregular hours, the discipline of a set table was something close to pleasant. He saw Eliza the evening he arrived. She was at Hollis's office. He should have expected that, and he did expect it. But there was still a moment when the door opened and she was there, standing at the desk with papers in her hands, wearing a dress that fit properly now, and her hair pinned up, and she looked at him with that direct level look, and something in her face went briefly unmanaged before she assembled it again. "You made it," she said. "Said I would." She looked at him for a moment, then she set the papers down and said, "How are the horses?" "Good. Better than good." He sat in the chair across the desk. "Mare's eye is improved." "The rinse works better in cold weather," she said. "The inflammation is partly seasonal. You'll want to continue it through summer too, just at a lower frequency." "You know a lot about horses for someone who grew up in a rich man's house." "My father had 30 horses," she said. "Nobody else paid attention to them when they were sick." "I did." She sat down. "How's the ranch?" "Surviving," he said. "Which is what it does." She looked at him. "Silas?" "It's fine," he said. "Really. I fixed the water channel from the north well last month, improved the flow to the east pasture. I've been thinking about expanding the cattle operation if the—" He stopped. "If things go the way they should." The water rights to Miller Creek, she said. Hall has mentioned that's part of the remedy being discussed, restoration of improperly transferred property. It is, she said. It'll take legal processing time after the trial, but yes, Miller Creek should come back to your family. She paused. To you. He sat with that for a moment. His grandfather had run cattle on Miller Creek water. His father had built the operation around that water. When it was gone, the ranch had shrunk around the wound of it, everything else contracting to accommodate the loss. Getting it back wouldn't undo what the loss had cost, but it would mean the ranch could be what it was supposed to be. Thank you, he said, for what you're doing, all of it, not just my family. She shook her head. I sat in my father's study and read his files for 3 years, she said. Everything I know, I learned from watching him build this. If I'd been the quiet and curious daughter he thought I was, none of this would be possible. She looked at her hands. I'm not being heroic. I'm using what I have. That's what heroic is, he said. It's not a feeling. It's a decision about what to do with what you have. She was quiet for a moment. You sound like someone who's been thinking about that all winter. I've had time to think, he said. The trial began on a Tuesday. It ran for 9 days. Silas sat in the observer section every day, the same way he'd sat at the first hearing. Not at the testimony table, not in the gallery of affected families that had grown to include representatives from 14 separate cases by the time the trial began, but in a spot where he could see both the testimony table and the defense, where he could watch the full shape of it. Vale himself was present. That surprised people who'd expected him to stay away, to manage it from a distance through his lawyers. But he sat at the defense table every day in a dark suit, with the composed attention of a man who had decided that his best posture was confidence, and he watched Eliza testify for 3 days without visible reaction. Silas watched him watching her. He was what Eliza had described, not a monster, not a caricature, a man in his 60s with the groomed ease of someone who'd spent decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered. He listened to his daughter systematically dismantle 30 years of carefully constructed fraud with the expression of someone attending a business meeting about a problem that could be solved by the right application of resources. On the 3rd day of Eliza's testimony, she described the conversation she'd heard at the age of 19, when her father had explained to a business associate that the difference between a successful man and an unsuccessful one was simply a willingness to define the rules of engagement before anyone else did. He meant, she said to Hollis's question, that he had decided early in his career that the formal laws existed as a framework that could be worked around by anyone with sufficient patience and resources. He didn't believe he was breaking the law. He believed he was operating in the space between what the law said and what it could actually enforce. And the families who lost their land and water were, in his view, people who hadn't understood the rules of engagement, she said. He didn't see them as victims. He saw them as opponents who had lost. From across the courtroom, Vale looked at his daughter. She looked back at him. It was the only moment in 9 days that Silas saw something crack in Vale's composure. Not dramatically, not in a way the gallery would necessarily have caught, but something moved in his face when she met his eyes without looking away, without the management, without the old reflexive submission that a daughter learns when her father is that kind of man. Just her, looking back at him, clear-eyed and unafraid and finished with pretending. He looked away first. Prescott worked hard. Silas gave him that. He was technically brilliant and relentless, and on the 4th and 5th days when he had Eliza on cross-examination, he found every gap he could and pressed it. He questioned her motives in exhaustive clinical detail. He constructed an alternate narrative in which a resentful daughter had spent years selectively reading her father's papers, looking for material to use against him. Eliza answered every question completely and without apparent rancor, which was its own kind of effective. It's hard to sustain a picture of bitter resentment against a witness who responds to hostility with calm specificity and never once rises to the bait. On the 6th day, the documentary evidence was presented, the actual records from Vale's files, compelled by the subpoena. Hall took them through each document methodically: the correspondence, the payments, the altered surveys, the purchase debt notes, the communications with court clerks and bank officers. The files said exactly what Eliza had said they said, Every document she'd described, every date, every name, every amount. There it was in the original, corroborating her memory point by point with the impassive authority of paper that doesn't care whose side it's on. By the seventh day, Prescott's cross-examination had become shorter, and his objections fewer. He was still working, still professional, but the quality of the room had changed the way it changes when something that was contested has become settled. Greer testified on the 8th day, Clara Reimer on the same day, in the afternoon. 4 other family representatives over the course of the trial. Silas testified briefly on the 7th day, not dramatically, just confirming what he knew about his family's history with Miller Creek and the timeline of the land dispute. He was on the stand for 20 minutes. He answered Hollis's questions and Prescott's questions and kept his answers factual and short. He was aware, the whole time, of Eliza watching him from the observer section the way he'd watched her. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on 17 counts of fraud, falsification of public records, and corruption of court officers. The jury had deliberated for 6 hours, which Hollis said later was neither fast nor slow, but exactly the speed of people taking something seriously. Vail was remanded into custody pending sentencing. Silas watched them take him out. Vail walked with the same composure he'd walked in with every morning, shoulders back, unhurried, the bearing of a man who was not going to give the room the satisfaction of seeing him diminished. Whatever else he was, he had a stubborn core of pride that wasn't going to bend for an audience. Silas didn't feel what he'd expected to feel. Not triumph, something quieter and less satisfying and more real. The specific relief of a thing that was wrong getting corrected, which is never as clean as you imagine it will be because the correction doesn't undo the years in between. His father was still gone, the years of contraction, of a man shrinking around a wound he thought was his own failure, couldn't be returned. The families had still lost what they'd lost. The mill was gone. The husband who'd written 4 letters that were never answered was still in the ground. The correction didn't fix all of that, but it fixed what could be fixed, and that mattered. It just mattered in a different way than he'd imagined. Not as revenge, not as balance restored, but as a line drawn. This is where it stops. It doesn't go further. Whatever comes next is built on ground that has been cleared. He found that he could live with that. Outside the courthouse, in the late afternoon of a spring day that had finally decided to commit to warmth, the people gathered on the steps had the particular quality of people who have been through something long and uncertain together and are not quite sure what to do now that it's finished. Clara Reimer was there. Greer, his ankle in a proper brace now, was talking to 2 of the other family representatives. Hollis was on the steps with papers under her arm, already talking to someone about the next phase. The civil remedy proceedings, the property restorations, the legal work that would convert a criminal verdict into actual returned land and water rights. The work wasn't done. It had changed shape. That was all. Eliza came out last. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at the city below, the same way she'd stood with Silas at the top of these same steps months ago when the investigation had just begun. Except different now. Something in the way she stood was different. Not dramatically, not the transformation that stories usually promised. Just a woman standing without the particular tension of someone perpetually managing what she shows. Silas went and stood beside her. They were quiet for a while. Below them, the city did what cities do. 17 counts, he said. There would have been 22, she said, if the Kelman and Ferris files had been among those produced. They weren't. We think they were destroyed before the subpoena. A pause. Halls is pursuing it separately. Of course she is. She won't stop, Eliza said. Not unhappily, like a fact she'd come to appreciate about the woman. Silas looked at the sky over the city. The blue of a spring afternoon that had finally gotten out from under the gray. What happens now? He said. For you. She was quiet for a moment. It was a real question, and she was giving it a real answer rather than a quick one. The civil proceedings will take another year, maybe more, she said. I'm a material witness in that phase too. Hollis needs me available. She paused. After that, he said. I don't know, she said. Honest about it. I've spent 6 months planning this and 8 months executing it, and I never let myself plan much beyond it because planning beyond it meant assuming it succeeded, and I didn't want to assume. It succeeded. It did. She looked at her hands, then at the city. I don't have a home, she said. I haven't had one for over a year. The capital is useful, but it's not. She stopped. It's not interesting, he said. She glanced at him, the almost smile. The ranch needs another pair of hands, he said. He kept his voice level, factual, the way he said things that mattered. I've been working it alone for 3 years, and it's never been enough. There's work that doesn't get done, and things that fall behind, and I'm not asking for something that isn't practical. He paused. But I'd be lying if I said it was only practical. She looked at him for a long moment. The watchfulness was there. But it was different from the watchfulness he'd first seen at the auction. Not the watchfulness of someone managing danger, but of someone taking something seriously. I know about fences, she said. I know you do. And barn roofs. Demonstrated. I know about horses, she said, and water channels, and the signs that a cattle operation is structured wrong, and how to fix it. A pause. I grew up watching a man build something. I learned how it's done. I just didn't want to build what he built. What would you want to build? He said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the city, at the courthouse steps, at the people moving below. Something that lasts because it's honest, she said, not because someone else has been prevented from taking it. She looked at him. Something worth defending. That's what I've got, he said, more or less, minus the water rights, which are coming back. She was quiet for another moment, then, the ranch is 400 acres. With the restoration closer to 700, he said, and Miller Creek through the east end. She nodded slowly, working something out in her head the way she worked everything out, systematically, honestly, without letting what she wanted distort what she could see. I'd need to finish the civil proceedings, she said. I can't leave the capital until Hall releases me from the witness obligations. I know. That could be a year. I know that too. And She stopped, started again. I'm not easy to know, she said. I'm told I'm not. I manage things. I don't always say what I'm actually thinking. I spent a long time in a house where honesty was a liability, and I carry that. I spent a long time on a failing ranch believing my family had failed, he said. I carry that too. We'd be 2 people carrying things, which is what everyone is. She looked at him. And there it was, the full thing, not the almost smile, not the managed version, just her, looking at him the way she looked at things she'd decided to trust. All right, she said. All right, he said. Below them, Clara Reimer was saying something to Greer that made him laugh, which was a sound Silas hadn't heard from the man before and found he was glad to hear. Hall was still talking to her colleague, papers in hand, efficient and relentless and already building the next thing. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. Vail received 12 years on the primary fraud counts, with additional time on the corruption charges. The sentence was longer than Prescott had expected and shorter than some of the affected families had hoped, which is how sentences usually go. A number that satisfies no one completely, but carries the weight of accountability. The civil remedy proceedings moved through the following year the way legal processes do, slowly, with frustrating pauses and occasional reversals, and the grinding administrative work of converting a verdict into actual transfers of property and water rights. Halls navigated it with the patience of someone who had waited 7 years to get here and was not going to get impatient at the last mile. The Cain family's Miller Creek water rights were restored on a Tuesday in March, 14 months after the criminal verdict. Silas got the paperwork in the mail on a Thursday, sitting at the kitchen table in the evening. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table and sat with his hands around a cup of coffee and looked at it for a while. He wrote to Eliza that night. The Miller Creek rights came through. You should know. She wrote back 4 days later. I know. Hollis told me the same day. I've been waiting for you to write it. He smiled at that. She came back to the ranch in late spring of the following year, when Hollis had finally cleared her from the witness obligations, and the civil proceedings were finished. She came with a single bag and the borrowed coat that she'd apparently never returned to Hull's. who had apparently never asked for it back. She stood at the property line the same way she'd stood there the first time, looking at the land. He stood next to her and let her look. The ranch was different than it had been when she'd first seen it, not transformed. It wasn't a story where everything becomes perfect. The barn was solid now, both the old section and the new roof she'd helped put on. The fences were tight. The cattle operation, reorganized over the winter along lines that a woman who knew about such things had suggested in a letter the previous October, was running more efficiently than it had in years. The gray mare and the gelding, in the pasture nearest the house, moved through the spring grass with the ease of animals that had been given what they needed to recover. Miller Creek ran through the east end of the property, where it always should have run. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he said. "Always has been." She picked up her bag, walked toward the house. She stopped at the south pasture fence, the one she'd fixed on her second morning, the one that had been her first offer of something in exchange for nothing, and ran her hand along the top wire. Sound. Still holding. "This'll need replacing in a few years," she said. "The posts are good, but the wire's showing age." "We'll replace it," he said. "In a few years." She looked at him. They went inside. That evening, sitting at the table where she'd first said her name and her father's name and changed the shape of everything, they ate supper and talked about practical things. The cattle rotation, the spring planting, what needed doing on the east section now that the water rights were restored. They talked about Greer, who had rebuilt his mill and was already in a dispute with a neighboring property about road access, which somehow felt like a hopeful sign. A man with something worth fighting for it through proper channels, the way it should work. They talked about Clara Reimer, who had written to say the North Creek was running fully again since the water rights restoration, and that her late husband's kitchen garden, which she'd let go after he died, was being replanted this spring. They talked about Hulls, who was building a new case. Different subject, same territory. Another pattern she'd been watching for years, waiting for evidence to catch up to what she already knew was happening. "She's never going to stop, is she?" Silas said. "No," Eliza said. "Some people are built that way." "You're built that way." She considered it. "I'm built to pay attention," she said, "and to not accept that a thing is permanent just because someone with power decided it was." She was quiet for a moment. "My father thought that was a failing in me. He said I had no instinct for accommodation." "He was right," Silas said. "That's not a failing." She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them, the window behind her showing the last of the spring evening light. "No," she said. "It turned out not to be." He cleared the plates. She spread some papers on the table, notes on the East Pasture water channel configuration, a rough calculation of what restoring the Miller Creek flow would allow in terms of expanded grazing acreage. They sat together and worked through it the way they'd sat and worked through fence posts and barn roofs and court testimony and the road through the Callow Hills. The way you work with someone who thinks differently than you do, and you've both learned that the difference makes the work better. Outside, the spring night settled over the land. The ranch was not perfect. It wouldn't be. Not this spring, not any spring. There would be hard years ahead, because there are always hard years on land that demands daily work and offers no guarantees. There would be things that broke, and things that failed, and seasons that didn't go the way they needed to go. There would be mornings that were harder than they should be, and evenings where the weight of what was still undone pressed down harder than was comfortable. But the land was theirs. The water was running where it was supposed to run. The fences were sound. The horses that nobody wanted had become horses that anyone would have been glad to have, given decent conditions and time. And two people who had both been written off. One by a world that looked at a woman in torn clothes at an auction and saw nothing of value, one by a version of his own history that told him failure was inherited, had looked at each other across the particular distance of distrust and decided, with the careful deliberateness of people who knew exactly what they were choosing, to trust anyway. That was the thing worth saying about it, if there was one thing. Not that justice always wins, because it doesn't always. And pretending otherwise is a lie that makes people feel better without making them any more prepared for reality. Not that good people always find each other, because luck and circumstance have too much to say about that for any neat conclusion to hold. Just this: That the people who are written off are not always wrong. That what looks like nothing, from a distance, from the outside, from the comfortable position of someone who doesn't have to look carefully, that thing is not always nothing. Sometimes it's exactly what it appears to be from the outsides. But sometimes it's a gray mare with a clouded eye who reads the ground better than horses with full sight. Sometimes it's a woman in a torn dress who has been paying attention to everything for years and is waiting, with patience that looks like defeat, for a single moment of decent treatment that tells her the conditions are right to finally move. Silas had spent $23 on 2 horses nobody wanted. He hadn't known what he was buying. That was the truth of it. He hadn't known. He hadn't made a smart investment or a calculated bet. He'd seen 2 animals that weren't broken and spent his last money on them. And when they threw in a human being with the lot he'd done, the only thing that seemed like the correct thing to do in that moment, without thinking past that moment. And the moment had turned out to be the beginning of something much larger than a moment. That happens sometimes. Not often enough, not as often as it should, but sometimes. The lamp burned low on the table. Outside, the gray mare and the gelding moved in the dark pasture, 2 shapes in the spring night, belonging to ground that finally had the water it needed to be what it had always been capable of being. Eliza looked up from her papers. "We should sleep," she said. "We should," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another few minutes. There was more to figure out. There was always more to figure out. The East Channel, the cattle rotation, the years ahead on land that asked for work every morning and didn't always give you back what you put in. The long, patient process of 2 people learning each other past the point of careful management into something more honest and more durable. All of that was still in front of them, but tonight the lamp was low, and the land was quiet, and what had needed to be set right was set right, imperfectly and at cost, and with no guarantees about what came next, which is the only way anything that matters ever gets set right. That was enough. For tonight, it was enough.